Hey there. Tonight, ash-dark skies over Sumatra, a supervolcano's winter, and a species learning to think together. What froze our bodies while our minds raced ahead? And why? After a near-extinction bottleneck, did story, tool, and memory become our shelter? Breathe easy. Settle into the pillows and follow the trail back some 1,000 years. The night biology yielded to culture before you get too cozy. If this kind of quiet storytelling helps you drift off, you can tap like and subscribe without lifting your head from the bed. Tell me the city you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing our little map of night owls and early risers. Now dim the lights. Let a small fan add that soft hum. Slow your breathing, and let's slip into tonight's journey together. Imagine the mouth of the volcano in Sumatra calm, only in the way a held breath is calm. It's not a cinematic explosion with red fountains, but a column of dusk rising into morning. A pillar that punches the sky and carries fine glass to the wind. Pebbles fall first, then ash as light as a moth's wing. Day bends toward evening, even at noon, for a while months, then years. In some places, the world remembers winter in the wrong season. This is not a single night of terror, but a long, powder-soft pressure on the lungs of the planet. People who live by reading small signs the way tubers store water, the way birds move before a storm, find those signs change. The old rules still work, but less reliably. Like a song remembered out of order. We shouldn't imagine everyone huddled in one cave. Some bands keep moving, patient as their shadow. Others linger where hot springs keep the ground warm, or where the coast lays out its quiet buffet of shell and weed. Somewhere a child learns that baked roots keep better if sliced thin and smoked. Somewhere else a woman knots a net with a pattern her grandmothers swore by, now reworked for colder shoal. When the sky is wrong, people make it right by telling each other what to try next. In such weather, a good sentence is a kind of shelter. There is a phrase that sometimes shows up in late-night debates, that humans stopped evolving. It's bolder than it needs to be, and not quite true. Bodies still adapt in small, local way, and would continue to do so. But if you step back, if you take the long, slow breath of deep time, you can see that the most forceful shaping no longer carved bone with the same intensity. Strong, directional pressure on anatomy softened because groups got better at helping one another survive. Fire and clothing, storage and sharing, warning and planning. Each was a set of hands cupped around a trembling flame, with more warmth inside the circle. Fewer traits were simply burned away by cold nights or empty days. Biology did not freeze. It relaxed, as if the blizzard had moved outside the walls, while the hearth took over the work. Picture one small camp in the lee of a stand of trees, where ash rests like frost on the leaves. The fire is set shallow in a basin scooped from the damp soil. The air smells of wet stone and bitter smoke. Above the coals, a flat slate warms hard roots until their starch loosens and sweetens. A pair of shells kept from a distant coast serve as scoops. Children nap with their faces tucked into fur. An older man, fingers cracked, teaches a teenager the trick of cutting a core with the grain, so blades snap thin and long. The lesson unfolds in murmured. How to brace the wrist, how to turn the pressure just before the break, how to listen for a note in the flint. Like a drop of water falling into a bowl. There is no classroom, there is a continuity. What would take years of trial and error alone is condensed into an evening by the fire. Far away, under another sky, a river carries ash and soft, gauzy ribbons. Fish rise to the warmth where groundwater seeps in. A woman watches the current while counting under her breath to pace a new pattern of traps. She adjusts the weave to the smaller flows, ties a marker knot for the next season, and hums a tune whose timing keeps her hands steady. This gentle scene is not dramatic, but it radiates the single most important feature of our species' survival, the habit of encoding experience and passing it along. The traps will survive the night. So will the song. When a population shrinks, there are long echoes inside the genome bottleneck signatures like the rings on a stressed tree. Some scholars tie the timing of those echoes to a disaster. Others urge caution. The careful voice is the right one to keep near the pillow. What matters for our story is not the exact depth of the trough, but the direction of the response. Whether the winter was global or patchy, brief or enduring in places, people moved through it with culture as their most reliable tool. They didn't wait for their bones to change. They changed the world that bones lived in. By the sea, a different kind of library opens each low tide. Rims of rock hold pools where anemones wait like tiny fists, and periwinkles scribble slow punctuation marks across the stone. The band that camps here does not know the word calorie, but they know that a sack of bivalves can be steamed in kelp, and that if you mix crushed shell into the edge of a clay cup, it will shrug off heat without cracking. They set aside a portion not for feasting, but for tomorrow, and the day after, and the cousin who is late to return. Planning is a soft technology, invisible as breath, and just as life-saving. We sometimes make intelligence a drama of individuals, a genius, a flash of insight, but in the ashlight, it looks different. Intelligence becomes a mesh, a net that catches ideas before they wash away. A child watches a gesture. A grandmother corrects a posture. A brother invents a word for the knot that kept loosening until it didn't. None of this shows up as a new ridge on a skull. All of it shows up as survival that would have failed without the shared mind. Another evening, another camp, and a different thread in the weave. Care, the man with the cracked fingers, once healed from a broken leg. He walks with a memory in his stride. Years ago, the group slowed for it, carried wood and water, rotated watch duty so he could sleep without fear. In a harsher calculus, he would have been subtracted. In this gentler arithmetic, he remained part of the sum. His survival did something more than mark a moral victory. It changed what pressures reach the gene pool. When care becomes normal, selection stops acting like a cliff and becomes more like a slope. Edges soften. More kinds of people make it through the pass. You can hear, even now, a quiet debate at the edge of the fire about what to call the thing that is happening. Is it evolution? If the change is not in the bones, but in the behaviors and the tools, the answer, under these stars, is that the word matters less than the warmth of the solution. We could call it cultural selection, if we like the way better story, better methods, better cooperation rise and spread. The next family that passes by will borrow the trap design. The band beyond that will borrow the song, and each borrowing saves a wrist, a meal, a life. Ash still drifts down in the weak light of morning. Someone sneezes, and the camp laughs softly at the small echo. They will move when they must, not because they want to. They will carry embers in a bark tube, a nursing child in a pouch at the chest, a handful of seed, a few bright shells for trading, and the memory of how to read a sky that has forgotten the sequence of its seasons. Through them, the long night continues, but it thins. The world is, little by little, reinterpreted rather than endure. Tonight, as you settle deeper and your breath finds an easy pace, keep that modest image nearby. A sentence used as shelter, a taught gesture standing in for a mutation that would take 1,000 years to arrive. The ash in our story will settle. The winter will lift in places. Then widely, what remains is the habit of thinking together, a low, steady flame we learned to tend when the wind was cold and the days were dim. This is where our journey begins, at the threshold where biology eases off the reins and culture, patient and communal, leads the way through the gray. At the scale of a mountain ripping itself open, time behaves strangely. Hours blur into patterns of dark and pale as the ash cloud thickens and thins, and sunlight becomes a rumor. What begins as a roar slides into persistence. Dust that will not settle, cold that arrives in the wrong month, winds that carry a fine sting. If you could step far back farther than any person could, you would see a fountain of pulverized rock rise a dozen, perhaps dozens, of kilometers, then spread into an umbrella like a new, gray continent in the sky. Models suggest that sulfur-rich gases climbed with it, turning into aerosols that reflect light like 1,000,000 drifting mirrors. Estimates vary about how long the veil lasted. Some regions may have felt only a season of strangeness, others a handful of lean years. The careful words matter here. Likely, perhaps, in some places, but even cautious language cannot fully blunt what ash feels like in the mouth. In the first weeks, the world is a theater of small adjustment. Fires are ringed with damp earth to keep sparks from catching in the dry leaf litter that ash has disguised. Water skins are kept covered. Grit in the throat is a small misery that becomes a big one without care. The hunters test their usual paths and find the herds twitchy, their tracks confused by the dust. Birds alter their route, sometimes vanishing from a valley where they were as regular as a bell. Foragers, our most intuitive ecologists, shift to places with steady clues. Coastal shelves where tides ignore the sky. Warm seeps where plants still lift their heads. Read the stone, not the sky. An elder might say, passing a palm over a rock that sweats heat from a spring below. The ash is not uniform. In some places, it drifts like gray snow, leaving a powder that footprints remember for days. Elsewhere, it rains wet and heavy. And once dry hollows turn to paste, people learn to move differently. Shorter steps, lifted knees to keep the paste from sucking sandals off the feet. They learn to cook differently, too. Ash, carried by the lightest air, is a saboteur of teeth and lungs. So tubers are scraped and rinsed twice, then wrapped in leaves and laid onto hot stones, set deeper in the pit than before. So the steam rises clean. Children are told to breathe through a folded scrap of leather when the wind rises. Someone invents the habit of hanging a supple strip of fur at the threshold. Every return to camp begins with a swipe across the shoulders. A little rain of gray is ritual. At night, sky stories change. The old constellations are still there, but their clarity dull. The most precise navigators switch to new cues, coastal breezes, the smell of kelp at low tide, the angle of a river's current at morning chill. Ash mutes color. Ochre seems less bright, green less decisive. People look to touch and sound to make meaning. Nappers listen for the glassy note of a good flake. Weavers count beats with the tongue against the roof of the mouth. Fishers read the bass thrum of surf beyond the headland. This is not a collapse of knowledge, but a re-weighting of senses. The world is quieter, so the body attends to different instrument. Some bands move inland, following stone for tool making or game that prefers the lee of hills, where ash falls thinner. In one such band, a woman carries a tiny basket of seeds tied high on her chest, above the level where her toddler's hands can reach. She calls them sparks, a joke, and feeds one to the child when he is inconsolable. The seeds are not farming, they are an experiment in memory. She plants a few in a warm pocket of earth near camp, then marks the spot with a forked twig. If they sprout, she will know the season has not drifted too far. If they fail, she will try again along the wet edge of a seep or in soil kept warm by an old fire pit. What looks like a mother entertaining herself is also a test. When the world shifts, curiosity becomes insurance. The elder's role changes in weather like this. They can no longer guarantee rain by the star they used to trust, or a fat run of fish by the moon, as it was. But they remember cycles of strangeness, and the cache of memory is broad. When the birds stopped, the shellfish did not. When the rivers ran milky, the springs tasted clear around the fire. They turned fear into lists. Which roots keep longest if sliced thin? Which tree resin burns clean with least smoke? Which caves drink drafts like a flute when the wind is raw? It is not magic. This work just accumulated experiment and a kindness for those who come next. One day, in a place where the ash has crusted over with a thin skin like ice, a boy running too fast breaks through and goes to his knees. The crust seals his calves as if they've been painted in gray clay. He laughs, embarrassed, then feels the sting as grit gets under the crust and chafes raw. That evening, his mother takes a strip of tanned hide and wraps it around his calf, binding it lightly. In the morning, a change. Before anyone leaves camp, they sit and bind the tender parts, the outer ankle, the back of the heel, the thin skin over the instep. It takes 5 minutes and keeps a day from breaking down at noon. In harsher stories, evolution is something that happens to you. Here, across 1,000 such 5-minute choices, it becomes something you do together. Food webs tremble. In some valley, fruit fail, and the animals that depend on it drift away or weaken. Elsewhere, a lake, darkened by fine dust, warms by a finger's width, and small fish breed early, slipping their eggs into a new calendar that happens to favor a patient gatherer with a woven scoop for a time. There are local booms alongside regional busts. People do what they've always done best, notice, and what they learned to do sometime in the deep past tell. A stranger's story becomes part of your survival when the sky is wrong, and hospitality becomes practical theology. You feed a traveler because they might carry it in their mouth. The sentence that keeps your cousin alive next winter. We can imagine a meeting on a cobble bar in a river that has braided itself thin under the ash. Two bands with different accents and similar need. Gifts are set down between them. A roll of resin with a leaf pressed into it as a signature. A string of drilled shells with a bead unlike the others to signal it was made beyond the next ridge. Trading here is not the musical glory of distant empires. It is low and worn. How far is the good spring? How long does the cough last? Which direction brings less dust on the tongue? Knowledge is bartered alongside stone and hide. Children want, and the watching is an apprenticeship in trust. None of this cancels the difficulty. There are weeks when the cough moves through camp like a thin-handed thief, taking sleep and leaving weakness. There are days when the ash returns after the wind had promised a clearing, and firewood feels heavier than before. In such time, it is easy to imagine a selection regime that bites hard only the strongest, only the swiftest, and yet, if we look at the pattern that emerges from healed bones and the quiet signatures inside ancient DNA, what we see is endurance shared. The harshest edges of selection are dulled not by luck, but by design. The design of cooperation, of planning, of teaching. Bodies still change where the environment demands it. But the main pressure that decides who sees another spring has shifted inward, into the lattice of culture. When morning finally brings a thinner light, a woman steps outside the windbreak and pinches ash between finger and thumb. It is finer today, almost like flour. She smiled, not because the world has mended, but because thinner ash means the air may carry less grit, and the fish traps might stay clear longer. She turns back in and shows the pinch to her daughter, who imitates the motion, making her own guess at what it means. In this gesture is the entire argument. Given a long enough ash fall, people will build a shelter. You can't see rules of thumb, shared maps, little rituals that keep breath easy. Those shelters can be carried as lightly as a song. If you're listening in the dark and imagining it, let it be near the sea for a moment. A clean-lined shelf of rock, flat as a page, and the tide writing its patient store. Let there be a pit oven at its edge, lined with stones that crack quietly when they're ready. Let there be hands moving in ordinary grace, a net mended with a new knot, a shell cup roughened with grit so it won't slip. Above all, let there be the murmur of instruction, the voice that makes winter survivable without asking bones to become something else. The cloud will thin. The wind will change. What remains and grow is the habit of telling each other how to live in a world that changes underfoot. In the dark mathematics of small numbers, a campfire can feel like the whole world. A dozen faces in a ring becomes the census of a species in your heart. And the silence beyond the light seems to have swallowed everyone else. Genetics would later give us language to talk about this feeling. Bottlenecks and effective population sizes, alleles sifting like sand through a narrow throat, but the lived experience is simpler. Fewer people, fewer voices, fewer hands to carry the stories forward. The sky may have cleared in places after the ash, but the long echo of scarcity lingers in bodies and in memory. Imagine a woman with a cord of shell beads she has inherited, each drilled by someone whose name survives only as a warmth in a winter tale. She threads them again tonight because some things must be repeated to stay real. The shells are not a currency. Exactly. They are an archive. Proof that once there were cousins on a farther shore and that the path between here and there was known. In times of thin number, such objects are more than decoration. They are reminders that the circle can widen again. In a genome, rare variants can vanish by chance when numbers fall. In culture, whole skills can blink out if the only carrier sleeps and never wakes. The band does not know the word drift, but it knows the fear of losing a knot. No one else remembers how to tie. What does it mean? Exactly. To say that our kind passed through a narrow place. The careful answer starts softly. It means that if you stood far above time and watched the river of genes flow, you would see a stretch where the channel runs thin and shallow, not dry, never dry, but constricted enough that much of the river's older complexity does not pass through. Later, when the channel broadens again, the water carries almost all its force from that thin stretch onward. A few lineages, by chance and by care, become the ancestors of many. This does not need a single cause hammered into certainty. It can be a tangle of pressures that, together, make numbers small enough that luck begins to steer outcomes more than usual. Necessity. Around the fire, someone least likely to tell a story speaks up. Her voice is low, and the children lean in. She tells how, Before she was born, there were 5 families in their wintering place, and then there were 3. No battle, no grand catastrophe, just the slow arithmetic of late calves, a sickness that took elders first, and a river that shifted its mouth a little too far from the usual beds. She does not cast it as tragedy. She casts it as a lesson in counting. We had to share the name, she says, meaning the roles as much as the syllables. The woman who knew where the best digging sticks grew by the riverbank taught 2 others. The boy whose hands had the rhythm for grinding learned to teach, because if he didn't, bread would vanish when he did. In small populations, redundancy is not waste. It is a lifeboat. We can let the mind's camera drift to a later scene in another camp, where a teenager sits with an elder, and the elder is drawing in ash with a burnt stick. He marks circles and lines like path, and he is not mapping land, but inheritance. Who favored a particular way to knot, who carried a sweet tooth that made a child reach for ripe fruit first, who tended to grow tall and who did not. He does not distinguish between the parts that pass in blood and the parts that pass in the mouth and hands. All of it is continuity. All of it is how the clan persists through numbers that threaten to round down to 0. When numbers fall, chance plays a louder drum. A trait that had been common can disappear simply because its bearers were on the wrong bank when the river rose. Another trait, no better in itself, can become a hallmark because a single family happened to have many children who lived. The language of fit and fittest is too hard-edged for this. The truer picture is a quilt whose surviving patches are as much about where the snags were as about the strength of the cloth in such weather. The most important selection can be for ways of living that buffer against further loss. Pair bonding patterns that spread care across kin. Food-sharing norms that ensure the unlucky hunter is not the hungry father. Exogamy rules that send a daughter to a distant camp with a song and a knot no one there has seen. Culture, once again, acts as a quiet hand over the candle, keeping the flame from guttering. There are bones that speak to this gentler selection. Long-healed fractures, teeth worn by years of grinding grain that someone else fetched when fever kept the grinder prone. Skulls that show the soft path of a childhood infection survive. None of these are slogans. They are murmurs. They say that in the arithmetic of survival, the group decided again and again that slowing down for one was a way to arrive together. And a camp that arrives together is a camp that keeps more of its rare variants, genetic and cultural alike. This is not a metaphor but a mechanism. Cooperation makes small populations less likely to stumble into the blind alleys that chance sets everywhere. The darkness has not only dangers, but also clarities. With fewer voices, each story matters more. With fewer hands, each instruction is weightier. The woman with the shell beads teaches a child how to recognize the faint sheen that means a bead will drill clean instead of splinter. The lesson is small and exact. In a big world with many teachers, it might be forgotten as a quaint detail. In a small world, it is everything. The same is true at the level of mutations and lineages. With fewer births, each change, whether in a letter of DNA or in the pattern of a net, looms larger in the future's memory. Sometimes we picture the bottleneck as a throat of stone that squeezes travelers and grinds the weak to dust. That image misses the softness that kept us. The true throat is made of agreements: who eats when food is thin, who sleeps first on what, whose word counts when 2 risks look equal. The bands that wrote kinder rules became the bands that left many descendants. Not because kindness is a spell, but because it keeps numbers from going to 0 when luck turns. In a long enough night, mercy is a survival trait. There is, too, the quiet math of mating. In thin time, it is dangerous to marry too close. Dangerous also to wander so far that your language breaks and trust cannot bridge it. Somewhere in this era, customs evolved to balance these risks. Songs that encode who is kin and how closely. Journeys that bring a young adult to a distant wintering camp with a gift and a name. Out of these errands come children who carry 2 dialects in their mouths and an extra layer of resilience in their genome. The people do not measure heterozygosity. They measure harmony at the fire and the feel of plenty in the seasons after a drought. But the 2 measures rhyme. Let the last image tonight be this. Morning on a plain where ash has thinned to a ghostly dust. A small group stands ready to move. They have no flag to plant, no monument to leave. What they have is lighter and harder to break methods, norms, a few bright shells that prove the wider world exists, and the memory of a winter that taught them to share. The bottleneck is not just a loss, but a shaping an hourglass that taught our species where the narrow places are and how to build bridges across them. As the group steps out, their footprints write a sentence the wind will take, but the children will remember. Keep teaching, keep trading, keep counting, and the circle will widen again. Archaeology is a patient reader of absences. It listens to where the story thins and tries not to confuse quiet with nothing. After long winters of ash and lean years of learning how to live around it, the pattern that remains in the ground is not a single headline, but a scatter of changed habits. At some sites, hearths go cold and stay that way. At others, the charcoal shifts from fat wood to twisted shrubs, as if fuel ran short. Shell middens that once climbed like low hills pause their growth. Blade styles that had marched along a shoreline from cove to cove suddenly stall, like a traveling song no one forward to a trowel. Silence is date. Imagine a bay where people once stopped regularly, good stone nearby, fresh water in a trickling rim, a sheltered notch that kept cook fires from the worst winds. Before, the beach was a ledger of comings and going, footprints pressed into damp sand. A scatter of broken shells, a few flakes of stone where someone thinned a core while watching the tide. Then, for a stretch, the ledger looks blank, not because the ocean smoothed it, but because the visit stopped or thinned until a single camp left no more trace than a tightened knot. When excavators open a trench centuries late, they find a gap in layers, a thin film of wind-laid dust instead of fire-reddened soil. The absence is not proof of catastrophe everywhere. It is proof of interruption here. Across a continent, many such small interruptions add up to a new map. Trade, which is the bloodstream of ideas as much as goods, shows the change with particular clarity. Picture a necklace in the hand, the weight of it, the clink of beads against one another. Before the ash years, someone wore on their chest a mixed string, bone from a local deer, river-tumbled quartz from a day's walk inland, and, most tellingly, a few bright shells from a coast many days away. Those distant shells are how archaeologists know paths existed. They cross-check the species, the age, the break pattern, and whisper, yeah, these once moved along a human chain from shore to shoulder. Then the sequence breaks. For a century or three, that shell species vanishes from inland graves. Later it returns, perhaps in a different ratio, perhaps accompanied by a new stone that naps even cleaner than before. The route went dark, then glowed again. In the interlude, we can read a narrowing of horizons. Let the mind walk into a cave where people once painted. The ochre on the walls is weathered. The soot on the ceiling is thin. In one corner, a scatter of beads lies where a string broke. A layer above, nothing but dust and a single rodent bone. A layer above that, charcoal returns and ash is crushed underfoot again. But the new hearth is in another room, and the beads change shape as if a different group brought different preferences. Continuity pauses, then resumes by another hand. An archaeologist would lay a transparent grid over this and plot the counts with a pencil. We, listening in bed, can simply note the hush and the new voice that follows it. The spread of techniques slows, too, before the wintering sky. A long, elegant blade form may have moved along the coast like a rumor, each camp copying the next and improving the trick in tiny ways. Then, for a time, neighboring coves do not share as much. One band keeps making their old sturdy points. Another experiments with microblades that waste less stone. Distance, once bridged by visits and marriages, becomes a larger problem when numbers thin and risks grow. A good idea can be trapped in a small circle until the wind shifts and paths open to feet again. None of this means the world empties. In some places, people stay and the layers stack without a skip, just with different ingredients. The charcoal shifts species. The bones favor animals that thrive in cooler edges. Seeds in the ash tell of plants that tolerate dust and short summers. There are regions where archaeologists find no pause at all, or only a subtle slowing so delicate it disappears if you tally by decades instead of years. Those continuities matter as much as the gaps, and they keep us humble. The story is a mosaic of many tiles, patches of crisis, patches of resilience, and long corridors where life simply curves around the hard parts without drama. There is a kind of stone that travelers carry for reassurance, a palm-sized cobble polished by a river, chosen not for utility, but for feel. Think of it as a travel stone, a private compass, People rub it in idle moments, a small ritual that makes distances shorter and choices steadier. In one valley, a certain bluish river stone used to appear now and then. In camps far from any blue river, the stone told of a path, a tie, a cousin who visited in spring after the sky changed. Those stones stop appearing. A generation later, they return, but now with drill holes at one end, worn smooth by string, as if their significance had been formalized, no longer a pocket charm, but a visible pledge that the old road is open again. The archaeology of feeling is quiet, but it leaves traces like this at the edges of utility. Pottery is far in the future for our scene, but even without pot, the ground keeps track of how people cooked and with whom. Hearths become shallower for a time, as if fires were kept smaller or more tightly controlled to hide their smoke in strange winds. Pits lined with stones appear and vanish, suggesting earth ovens used when wood was wet or scarce. The distribution of hearths within a shelter changes, too. Instead of one big communal fire, there are several small ones along the wall, each with its own scatter of bones and shell. Perhaps bands wintered together less often. Perhaps small families kept more to themselves in thin times and met other groups on neutral ground for brief, careful exchanges. If so, the layout of ash circles will remember it even when every name has blown away. Even tools that look the same keep the story if we listen to what they're made from. The core rock that becomes blades can be traced to specific outcrops by its impurities. In good years, a band might carry preferred stone over long distances, showing up hundreds of kilometers from the quarry with the same glassy signature sparking under a flake scar. In hard years, the signature fades locally. People make do with poorer stone from closer to camp, accepting thicker blades, rougher edges, more frequent resharpening. The skill is still there, but the supply line is shorter. When the good signature returns after a gap, it marks more than taste. It marks a path rediscovered, a friendship renewed, a risk deemed worth taking again. What should we not do with this record? We should not write a single steep line across the map and call it doom. There is evidence enough for thinning and for retreat, but also for cleverness tucked into crannies. Beads still drilled in dim caves, pigments still ground, stones still struck with a rhythm that pleased the ear as much as the eye. The better story, the truer, quieter one is that migration routes and trade loops breathed, constricted and dilated, as humans rode out weather and chance. In places, a seasonal round broke. Elsewhere, a new round formed that favored springs and shores over forests now muted by ash. Let a last image settle before we sleep. A beach at low tide, where the old path along the headland once saw many feet. The sand is blank, but on a flat rock above the reach of the highest wave, a single bead lies caught in a crack. It is not from here. It came, somehow, on the wrist of a traveler who rested and moved on. For a few generations, that bead would have been rare, inland or common. Now it is alone, then later common again. In that solitary glint caught in stone, the whole pattern reveals itself. Roots dimming and brightening, ideas flickering but not going out, and a species that leaves, even in its quietest decades, enough for the patient reader to find. By the time the ash thins and the wind forgets its old anger, something else has thickened between people, a felt layer of habit and meaning that holds like a woven sling. You can call it behavioral modernity if you like, though the phrase feels colder than the thing it points to. What it means, whispered into our blanket of night, is that a mind can now build a second world around the first one made of signs and schedules, kinship rules and story, little agreements about how a tool should look and what a bead should say. The bones do not announce this shift. Campfires do. Start with color. In a shallow bowl, the half shell of a giant mollusk or a smoothed stone, a paste of ochre and fat is worked to a luster that glows even in poor light. A fingertip draws a line along a child's cheek, a mother's brow, a hunter's forearm. The red is not only for beauty. It is a signal that can be read, of belonging, of readiness, of a day set aside for a thing the band needs to do together. Sometimes the pigment meets stone. A palm presses against a cave wall, and breath carries paint around fingers in a soft halo. It is not a signature in the modern sense. It is a proof that a person stood here, and that hands can leave echoes where voices cannot carry. The mark lasts longer than a life and says, without words, this is a human place. Then there are the strings. A thin leather thong, A plant fiber twisted against the thigh to cordage. A sinew teased to thread. Without string, the world is pieces. With string, pieces stay together. The stone head meets the wooden shaft with a sleeve of binding. The child's toy of knotted loops becomes a memory machine for counting days. The net that once caught only chance now holds a run of fish as if a plan had arms. A woman teaching a teenager to reverse twist fibers is teaching multiplication. One strand becomes two, becomes four, becomes a line that can outlast weather. Across that line, ideas cross too. Composite tools appear, not as a thunderclap invention, but as a drift toward efficiency. A stone flake alone can cut a hide. Hafted to a handle with resin and bound tight, it can cut hides for hours without flaying a palm. A small blade set into a groove becomes a micro saw for bone and antler. A harpoon point layered from bone and inset stone teeth bites deeper and releases easier. None of this is a miracle. It is the slow courage to try a third way when the first two were good enough. The courage is contagious. Neighbors who visit borrow the trick. Cousins in another valley see the neat seam and bring resin back to their own fire. Best practices is a thin modern phrase for such warmth. Trade thickens with intent. We already watch shells wander inland. Stone wander out to sea. Now, strings of beads begin to match in pattern across camps that do not share a hearth. A certain sequence dark, pale, pale. Dark shows up on wrists a week's walk apart. It is not that there is a guild of designers. It is that minds have begun to agree at a distance. Agreement is a technology as real as a spear. It keeps peace, stores credit, remembers favor. If you wear this, a woman tells her brother before he carries goods to a cousin over the ridge. They will know who taught you the knot. Recognition replaces testing. Risk fall on the shore. The menu grows. Hooks of bone are carved with a throat and barb. Baskets are weighted with stones and lowered into channels to fish, while hands are free for other work. A child can contribute, not just by gathering, but by tending, by timing, by knowing that when the third wave, after a lull, slaps the rock, just so, a certain ledge will lift its crab. Far inland, the same intelligence appears where rivers shrugged off ash sooner. Fish dams built from interlocked stakes. Weirs that encourage a run into a pocket where spears wait only at the last moment. A good weir is a document you can read. A designer's intent in the angle of every stake, and the hearth itself changes. It is no longer only a hollow for heat, a comfort against night. It becomes a stage for instruction, a factory floor, an altar for stories. Stones are chosen not just for availability, but for how they crack when heated. A flattish slab is set at the edge for drying slices of tuber. A separate, smaller fire is kept for the resin work, away from the smoke that would sour the bond. The hearth radiates concentric circles of task and meaning at its edge. A child points to a stone with a fleck of mica and invents a name that makes everyone smile. Later, the name survives the child's small hands and joins the band's vocabulary. Language grows, as do string, one word twined around another, until an idea can cross a gap without falling. If we lean in further, we find rules that did not need bones to grow teeth. A no takes shape around quarrels. No spear points near the sleeping hides. No laughter during the first bite offered to the dead. A yes gathers around work. Yes to sharing the first basket's worth with the old ones. Yes to singing during the rain mending. To keep the count straight, these customs are architecture you care. They brace the camp against collapses that once would have culled without mercy. A woman who knows where the late mushrooms rise gets sick in the last week of the lean season. By rules. A cousin who learned her map takes the task. The map is shared because the rule said it must be, not because a gene forced it. Behavioral modernity is sometimes listed like a museum placard. Personal ornaments, long-distance exchange, standardization of tools, symbolic behavior, planned shelter, perhaps music. The list is true enough, but it misses the temperature. The air around people is warmer with expectation. A child is not only born to a shelter of skin and wood. They are born into a nest of assumptions that they will be taught to speak, to bind, to measure, that their voice will be recruited into the chorus that tells when to move camp and when to stay. A baby laid close to the fire is already under a roof of sentences. In one camp, a story is told about why the net must be mended before sundown. The story features a trickster otter who steals moonlight through holes in carelessness. Everyone knows it is a joke with a job. The job gets done. In another camp, a song counts up the landmarks between wintering grounds and the spring flat. Ridge, spring, bend, white stone, big silent, 2 pines, long step down, sung twice through it. It matches the time it takes to walk from the last water to safe camp. If you hum too fast, you will arrive thirsty. Children learn the tune the way lungs learn to breathe. This is not myth versus science. It is instruction fitted to the mouth. We might expect that minds growing richer would harden borders between camps, but often the opposite occurs. Richness wants audience. A more efficient fishing knot begs to be shown. A more durable resin begs to be traded. A song that keeps steps steady wants a harmony. The currency is attention. The interest rate is gratitude. A pattern that begins as one family's cleverness becomes a basin where others pour their own improvements. After a few seasons, no one can say whose idea it was, only that it works and that it feels like us. None of this erases hardship. A winter of strange wind can still flatten plans. A storm can still tear a shelter like paper, but the balance shifts. Where once a failure would be paid for in bones, the children in that camp did not see spring. Now failures are more often paid for in revision. The trap is rebuilt with a tighter weave. The story is updated so that the otter also steals time if you delay. The bead pattern adds a dark stone to mark a warning learned the hard way. Genes change slowly. The second world can change overnight. A final, small scene to keep as the eyelids lower. A grandmother sits with a child and a half-finished needle of bone. Light pools at their feet. She shows how to polish the eye so thread will not catch. Turning the shaft with a dampened thumb and a slip of sandstone. Listen, she says, and the child thinks she means the squeak of bone under stone. But she means the way a tool speaks when it is almost right. The lesson is not only how to make a needle, it is how to hear the boundary between good enough and durable. Between the thing that works today and the thing we can teach tomorrow. That boundary, more than any ridge on a skull, is the line across which our species stepped and did not step back. If tools are hands extended, language is time extended. A stone blade lets you reach further. A sentence lets you reach tomorrow. In the low light by the hearth, words begin to do what no bone could fold. Years of trial into minutes of teaching. Carry a memory past the lifespan of the person who made it. Braid strangers into a we that can move together through darkness. We do not know exactly when language gathered its full power. The evidence is shy and the wind of inference is always at our back. But we can sit by the fire here and watch something decisive. Speech thickening from pointing and grunts into instructions. From names into nested thought. From a map of places into a map of idea. Start with name. Before syntax grows tall, naming is already a kind of rescue. A woman presses 2 fingers to a certain rock shelf where limpets cling and says a sound that means only this ledge. Not any lead. The sound carries the tide table inside it. Carries also the warning that the third wave after a long lull will slap the stone hard. Children learn the sound. And the ledge becomes more than a feature of the shore. It becomes a shared promise. If you say and others see it, a hunter names a wind that smells of pine and distant sea. A napper names a kind of fracture that tells you a core will yield blades like sweet peelings. These names are pegs in the dark. Minds hang plans upon them. Then see the little gears click into one another. A mother kneels with her child and a bundle of plant fiber. Twist, she says, rolling the fibers away from her with her palm. Hold. The child pinches. Back, she says, and the child reverses her wrist so the 2 loose strands wind into a stronger rope. Each word is an arrow pushed along by breath, and each arrow lands in the right season, the right hand, the right pressure, the moment not to pull. Could you learn the rope without words? Perhaps slowly, by watching. But speech removes the need to guess which detail matters. It squeezes the confusion from the task until the essentials shine. The sentences stretch, twist, hold. Back grows to twist together until it sings. Another day. Make the loop before you tie, or the knot will bite under load. Now the words carry a small prophecy. Do this, or else. And soon the grammar itself holds a bridge between times. If the wind changes, move the traps to the west channel. A child, hearing that if, here's a tempo that joins cause to future effect. The mind that can nest in if can nest a story, and the story can nest a plan, and the plan can nest a warning for someone not yet born in the mind's camera. Shift to a napping floor where two cousins sit cross-legged with a half-lit core between them. The elder taps a thin blade free, then stops the young one's hand with a tut. "Not here," he says, because the grain runs like water to that edge. He draws a circle in the dust, and then a second circle inside him. Strike the second circle toward the first, and the wave will break where you want. This is not poetry. It is recursion. One circle inside another, one idea layered within a larger idea. The young cousin hears the instruction, sees the picture, and feels in his wrist the rhythm implied by both. To stack thoughts like this is a species trick. We build ladders in the air and climb them. Language does something even gentler. It lets care move with precision. A healer, working by lamplight, teaches a teenager how to bind a sprain. Wrap from the toes toward the heart, she said. Tight at the turn, then loose so blood can lag. The phrase is silly and exact. Laughter means flow. Too tight, and the skin will pale and throb. Too loose, and the joint will wobble unhappy. Without that sentence, the band might repeat its mistakes each season. With it, a lesson climbs into the future like a vine up a pole. Some nights, speech is not instruction at all, but play, and play sharpens the blade. A child delights in a word that can mean two things. An adult makes a joke that flips a rule to show its outline. Riddles practice attention. Metaphors practice leap-making. Songs practice breath and memory in the same measure. In one camp, two friends argue about whether the moon is a peeled fruit or a chewing stone for wolves. The truth is not the point. The point is that their argument trains a joint muscle, the one that can hold two possibilities in mind and test them against signs. That same muscle will later save a week of hunting when someone says, "What if the herd turned early this year?" And the camp, used to maybes, decides to check. We can feel, in these nights, how speech lowers the interest rate on risk. When you can tell a cousin in another valley exactly how the ice thinned under a dusting of ash, step where the reed shadows are denser, the water is shallower there. You export survival beyond your own body. Words become a kind of herd immunity against ignorance. Even the form of conversation matters. If one voice orders and the rest obey, the band gets the bandwidth of one mind. If voices trade, what did you see? What did you try? The band becomes a braided river of observations that can find a new channel when the old one silts up. Some sentences are not true yet and become so when acted upon. We meet when the hill swallows the sun, a line that invents a rendezvous where none existed. You carry the shells, I carry the resin, and we both carry the child, a line that invents a division of labor and then makes it real. This creative mood of language, soft and ordinary, is how institutions start. Before there is law, there is a sentence said with enough agreement around it that it becomes furniture in the room. The furniture outlasts the speaker. Do we know when the recursion, the ability to nest phrases inside phrases, fully joined the human voice? No, the record is a whisper. But our scene does not need a timestamp to show its consequences. Watch a father telling a story. The man who knew the path that the spring follows under the hill told the woman who knew the song that keeps steps steady to teach the child who... The tale coils back on itself like a basket rim. No one stops him. The child leans closer. The mind that can follow the coil can also follow a plan whose parts depend on one another. Before you lay the weir, cut the stakes. Before you cut the stakes, wet them so they bend. Before you wet them, gather bark to wrap the joint. 3 befores in a row is a ladder made of time. We feel. 2. The book that language writes into the body. A young runner learns to pace by a rhyme. 4-beat lines for trotting. 3-beat lines for the quick push up a slope. A fisher learns to listen for the small drum of snails in a basket to know when the bottom layer is alive enough to eat tomorrow. A weaver keeps count through song and never misplaces a crossing. In all this, words are measurement you can carry in your chest. There are dangers to speech. A lie can spread like fire on dry grass. A rumor can freeze trade between two camps that need each other. But even this risk is a sign of language's power. It can break and it can bind. Communities respond with countermeasures. Rituals for vetting testimony, witnesses for bargain, taboos against certain boasts. In one band, no one may speak on a success the day it happens. You wait until morning, when sleep has cooled the tongue. The rule is not mystical. It reduces the fever of exaggeration and gives space for correction. At last, Think of one sentence that may matter most, the one that turns knowledge into inheritance. Tell me how. A child asks it again and again. An apprentice asks it without shame. A traveler asks it softly at a stranger's fire. The answer turns out to be a structure, not just a string of gesture. First do this, then do that, unless the light is low. In which case, reverse the order. To speak a conditional is to grant the listener a pocket-sized laboratory. They can test the clause and keep the result over years. These clauses pile into a library that the band can consult without opening anything but a mouth. If you're listening with eyes closed, let the final image be small. A mother and her daughter at dusk. The daughter tracing the same line in the dust that her mother did yesterday. The mother says nothing for a while, then, lightly, "Not there," where the dust is cooler because the sun left sooner. The daughter shifts her hand and smiles at feeling rightness line up under her finger. In that small correction is the whole arc of this part of our story. Language turning rough, guesses into durable skill, shaping futures with ifs and thens, and making a camp of a few dozen into a mind wider than any single skull. The night deepens. The words do their soft, continuous work. Cold used to be a verdict, before there were second skins and portable hearths. A sudden wind could thin a camp's numbers like a hard season thins the berry. What changed was not the weather's mercy, but our ability to bend it. Fire and clothing. Two quiet revolutions turned climate from judge to condition. Neither left bold marks in bone. Both left a different sort of trace. Warmth folded into routine. Travel extended by season. Children laughing in months that once kept mouths shut. Begin with ember. Fire was old by the time ash fell from strange sky, but the relationship ripened. The band learned to carry flame as if it were kin. Glowing coals cupped in a bark tube lined with damp clay. The mouth stopped with moss that breathed just enough. A good ember could be smuggled a day's walk between breaths. There was craft in tending it the way you cradle the tube beneath your cloak. The way you feed it a sliver of resin at midday so it purrs. The way you knock ash back to red with a fingertip's patience. Kindling became a taxonomy in the mine. Feathered slivers for shy spark. Twig bundles for new confidence. Punky wood when flame should crawl and not leap. A person who kept fires alive through a wet week was as esteemed as a hunter who could read muddy tracks and glare. Around those embers, the architecture of warmth improved. Windbreaks were set not just where rock offered shelter, but where convection could be tricked. Walls bent inward slightly at the ends to curl air. Roofs pinned with weighted reeds, so drafts hissed high instead of at sleeping cheeks. Stones learned jobs. Some were selected to store heat and give it back through the long hours. Some to shield flame from hungry gusts, some to sit upon, so the cook's knees did not stiffen. A careful camp kept 3 fires a big, open-hearted one for light and company, a mean little stingy one for resin and glue, and a low, stubborn bed of coals that hardly showed, for waking to warmth, even in the hour before dawn. When doubt is loudest, fire shaped food into fuel fit for coal, roots that rasped at the teeth, when raw turned sweet with slow heat. Grains that would have torn a stomach became porridge. Tough sinew softened to shared soup that warmed hands as much as bellies. People learned that fat is a fleece you wear from the inside, and that a cup cupped in both palms is a decision to live. At the edge of the blaze, children roasted snails in their shells and laughed at the small drum each made when done. Those drums were metronomes for patience. Clothing, meanwhile, turned skin into a negotiator. What began as simple wraps, hide over shoulders. Grass skirts against abrasion grew into designed systems, layers that trapped still air. Seams that did not rub raw. Closures that could be managed with cold-numbed fingers. Needles came earlier than we used to think. Their eyes polished smooth so thread slid without biting. Their points drilled rather than forced so bone would not splinter. Sinew was teased and wetted and twisted to thread that shrank tight as it dried, binding seams like a second breath. The first time a child saw a hood that turned a face into a little cave, they understood at once why it mattered. The wind could look for a cheek and not find one. We cannot carbon date leather. It vanishes into soil and time. But some clues walk beside the missing coats. One is small and a little impolite. Lice. Human head lice and clothing lice are cousins who parted ways when clothing became a home worth colonizing. Genetic clocks carefully hedged always suggest that this split happened deep in our past, well before cities, well before agriculture, likely in the era when our nights lengthened with ash and our horizons stretched with trade. It is not proof with a trumpet. It is a murmured timestamp that says, people wore enough on their bodies, often enough, that another species specialized to live there. Clothing was no longer an emergency measure. It was a habitat. What sorts of garments crossed that threshold? Picture an unrolled hide laid on flat stone, scraped thin with a flake held at the perfect angle so it sings a quiet glassy note, holes punched with an awl. Follow the curve where a sleeve will join a body. The perforations set like beads close enough to hold, far enough to flex. A woman threads sinew and pulls, not in a straight line, but in a rhythm her mother taught her. 2 forward, 1 back, half a hole, so tension spreads and the seam remembers motion. She lines the hood with softer fur and turns the ruff to the wind. A cousin plets grass into insoles that wick sweat before it chills. Where season pinches hardest, down is teased from birds' bellies and stuffed into sacks of skin. An early, lumpy quilt. It is not elegant. It is sufficient. Sufficiency is triumph. Clothing made not just warmth, but privacy and ritual. The first time a band arrived at a spring, and all men, women, children stripped and laughed into the cold water before sewing season's grime from seams. Someone began a song that says what is allowed to be seen and wet. The song became rule, and the rule became a braid woven into the border of a winter cloak. A pattern whose presence on a hem murmured, "We keep modesty like we keep fire." In another valley, a particular bead pattern along a cuff meant I can sew your children's hoods if you will shape my spear shafts. Sleeves became contract. Travel changed with garment. Wind that once pinned families to leeward hollows could be faced. A band that would have wintered in place now walked the longer loop that took them to a reef only cold months exposed, harvesting shellfish too dangerous to take in stormy summer. A father and daughter crossed a shallow pass at dawn, wearing boots lined with dry grass, and learned where the ice sang thin. The memory of that tone joined the word ho. A warning passed with a hum pressed through the teeth. People did not become invulnerable. They became negotiators whose bodies had allies. Fire and clothing also made homes for craft. By lamplight that did not smoke too much, elders could teach after dark. Winter nights lengthened the school day. Fine work thrives under warmth. Beads multiplied because fingers did not sting so soon. Thread grew ever more consistent. The tiny margins where excellence hides became visible and repeatable. A child who learned to scratch lines within a thumb's width without slipping would later lay seams that did not leak in sleet. These are not luxury. They are the difference between a wet child and a sleeping one. The community learned to carry warmth into the places where cold most loves to bite. A baby's cradle was not just a sling. It was a little weather system, fur inside, bark outside. A wind flap over the mouth that allowed breath to slip, but drafts to fade. Elders slept closest to the hottest stone. Young adults took watch on the windward edge, rotating by a schedule that matched stamina to danger. Everyone knew the morning rhythm: who knocks the coals, who lays the feathered sticks, who opens the smoke eye of the shelter, so the first breaths do not bite the lungs. These choreographies are culture's circulatory system, pushing heat where it is needed. Timing measures, so no single body has to do something so punishing that only genes could ever help. If we step softly into a day of bitter wind, we find it at the camp's edge. A man repairing a sandal. He pushes a bone awl through the sole to start a hole, then stitches with a figure 8 that hugs the edge. Beside him, a girl rubs bear fat into a strip of leather until it loses its squeak and becomes supple. She is learning to feel with her fingertips the exact moment before over-softening. When strength yields to slipperiness, their talk is sparse, mostly breath and little corrections. Above them, pale steam frays out of the hood of a woman carrying a sleeping infant. Nothing looks heroic. And yet the scene is why the band exists to be seen. We should be careful with claims of firsts. There were hearths before this cold, and cloaks before these winds, but it is fair to say that in this stretch, fire and clothing cohered into systems kits of habit and tool that made weather a parameter rather than a sentence. The genetic clocks will continue to be calibrated. The archaeological record will continue to be revised. The bedtime truth, the one we can sleep inside, is that people learned to seed warmth into the day's corners the way they later seeded grain into soil. With intention, with care, and with a view toward tomorrow morning. Let the last warmth of this part be small and specific. A grandmother sits with a boy and shows him how to tie off a thread so the knot nestles into the seam and does not rub his ankle on a long walk. Hide the knot where the wind can't find it, she says, and he smiles at the trick of the phrase. He will walk far in that boot, and when the cold comes low and sly around the stones, the knot will hold. Somewhere a tube of embers glows. Somewhere a hood breaks the wind's hand. Between them, a path exists that did not before, and our kind walks it, leaving only the faintest signature in bone, but a very bright one in tomorrow. Care changes the arithmetic. In a ledger that once tallied survival in hard-edged margins, could you run fast enough, lift long enough, endure cold enough, new columns appear. Who sat with a feverish child through midnight? Who chewed roots for the toothless elder? Who walked slower so a splinted leg could learn to be a leg again? When groups make room for these costs, the cost curve itself bends. Traits that would have been cut away by winter's blade persist long enough to be taught around, compensated for, sheltered inside a net of help. This is not the abolition of selection. It is its redirection from raw endurance toward the capacities that make endurance shareable. Picture a man who fell from a ridge last autumn. The break, above the ankle, was ugly bone talking through skin. In a harsher world, the story would end at the ridge. Here, it detoured. The band stopped for 3 days in a hollow, with good cover and water near enough to carry without jarring. 2 people took turns cooling the swelling with wet moss. A healer set the bones with a forked stick and a strip of bark, humming the rhythm that kept her hands steady. For weeks afterward, the camp's pace matched the clack of his crut. Hunters ranged out and brought meat back to wherever the slower feet had made home. Months later, he limped. Years later, he walked with a story in his stride and a habit of scanning for loose rock that saved a cousin one rain-slicked morning. The skeleton, if ever found, would speak of a long healing. What it could not say, but what the camp heard every day, was that this man became the best pathfinder they had. Care preserved a body. Preservation returned in skill. Look at the quiet technologies that bud where care takes root. A sling for carrying water that does not bounce a newborn awake. A cradle lashed to a frame so a mother's hands can scrape hides without losing sight of her child. A low bench for grinding grain that spares the back of an elder who has ground for decades. These are not luxuries. They are force multipliers. By keeping older bodies in the circle of usefulness, the band retains libraries maps in memory, lists of safe mushrooms, songs that match the length of a walk to a distant spring. An elder who cannot run can still warn. When the river's foam turns brown, the fish are soft and the stomach complain. That sentence might be worth 3 hair. Care has a tempo. Some of it is sprint, stop the bleeding, cool the fever, ease the cough. Some of it is long distance. Habits that prevent injuries from happening so often. In one camp, ankle wraps became standard after that boy we saw stepped through the ash crust. In another, a rule took hold, never cut alone. It slowed work, which is a cost. It halved laceration, which is a saving. A weaver ties a loop at the end of every net panel. Not because she needs it now, but because she remembers the night she mended by lamplight in a bitter wind. A loop makes cold fingers clever again. These small foresights are care stretched into the future. Food share, too, smooths the cliffs into slopes. On a lean day, the hair goes into a pot, so children get first broth and elders get second flesh. Hunters eat last, not because they are less valued, but because they will hunt tomorrow. The rule is not heroism. It is logistics under a moral name, and it shows up later in bone. Fewer tiny lines of arrested growth in children's teeth. Fewer starvation signatures in adolescent years. The band has, in effect, created a buffer against spikes in scarcity. Genetic selection still whispers, those with robust immune defenses still have an edge, but the loudest voice now is cultural. How well can a group manage calendars of want and plenty without letting anyone fall off the edge of the page? We can hear how care rewrites risk in the way people talk at day's end. You take first watch, I have the longer nap in me. You keep the fire, my hands are steadier for sinew. Work sorts itself, not by who can do everything, but by who can do this thing well now. Specialization blossoms in that light. Someone becomes the needle eye polisher, someone the sinew twister, someone the storyteller who can hush children without scaring them. In a purely individual contest, generalists win. In a cooperative contest, specialists can thrive, and the group's overall fitness practical. Immediate rises. There is a tender edge here we should name. Care can be costly enough to sink a band that offers it without plan. A camp that carries too many who cannot yet or no longer contribute may slow past safety. Communities invent balancing rules, seasons when the band splits, so foragers can move light while a smaller group tends the injured at an easy spring. Thresholds for when to move a camp, even if a healer shakes her head. Rituals for adopting a widow from a neighboring band, so burdens spread across kin lines rather than calcify in one hearth. The rules rarely announce themselves as arithmetic. They wear story. We move when the owl calls twice, says the tale, which is a way of saying we leave at dusk on the second day. Because that is how far we can carry the broken without breaking the carriers. The archaeological whispers we have are consistent with this gentler regime. Healed fractures are common enough to make chance an unlikely explanation. Spines show the slow signatures of lives lived laboring. Joints show the polish of many tasks, not one. Grave goods tucked beside those who could not have hunted in their last years. Hint that worth was measured on a different axis than output alone. None of this is absolute. There were cruel bands and careless seasons, and even kind bands lost people when luck snarled, but the general drift is clear. More people survived insults that would have killed them earlier in our story, because others made room for their recovery. Care ripples beyond bodies into memory architecture. A child who watches her uncle be fed before he is useful again learns two lessons at once: that she is held by a net, and that she will one day hold. The transaction extends across time. You survive childhood because someone ground grain while your fever burned. You grind grain later so someone else's child can get through a winter cough. Reciprocity becomes less tit for tat and more like a climate always there, sometimes stormy, mostly just present as a background against which life happens. In that climate, innovation spreads faster because trust lowers the friction of sharing. Take my knot, someone says, and show me your trap. The sentence assumes a tomorrow together. Even mating rules bend toward buffering. Exogamy marrying out transports not only genes, but obligation. A woman who leaves to join another band sends, in her place, a rope of expectation. Her brothers will trade meat for her safety in lean years. Her new band will open its spring to her kin when drought shrinks theirs. The child born of that tie carries two vocabularies and two maps, and can harmonize them when a caravan of cousins arrives with news. Gene flow and story flow blend. Diversity, the kind a population geneticist measures, and the kind a singer hears in a room, both rise. We should be careful not to over-polish this picture. Care does not eliminate hard choices. Sometimes the splint fail, sometimes the fever does not break. Sometimes a band must leave an elder with a cash and a kiss because the river is rising, and a dozen small bodies will not make the far bank before dark. Such moments carve scars the archaeology can almost hear. But even here, care leaves structures behind. A practice of returning after winter to bring the elder's beads home. A taboo against using the elder's favorite tree for fuel that winter. A story that turns their name into a star to teach children the route. These are not consolations only. They are continuity tools that keep grief from shattering the lattice. In the genetic record, the echo of all this is subtle. You will not find an allele for tenderness. What you may find, over long span, is a pattern, more variance persisting than a purely brutal filter would allow. Fewer signs of directional changes driven by seasonal cold or sudden scarcity. Local adaptation still blooming where they must high-altitude breath, milk after weaning. But the chassis held steady by a workshop's worth of hacks and helpers. The selection gradient tilts toward minds that can organize care, coordinate schedule, update norms, and teach towards social intelligence as survival kit. Hold one last, quiet image as the room dimmed. A teenager sits with an elder whose hands tremble. They are fletching arrows. The teenager does the cutting. The elder places feathers and hums, a rhythm that marks equal spacing without needing to look. If you hum too fast, the elder says, smiling, the arrow will wobble. The teenager slows, and the feathers align as if a compass had clicked. 2 heads, 1 task, a small, shareable excellence. The band will carry those arrows tomorrow. The song will travel with them, and with a child years from now who never met the elder, but hums anyway, because care taught them a tune that outlasts 1 pair of hands. Grain begins as a rumor, a scatter of seeds where a camp rested too long, a fringe of green rising taller on last season's track. Someone notices, someone returns to the same bend and finds the stalks easier to strip than wild cousins upstream. The shift is not a trumpet blast. It is a soft turning of feet back to the place that fed you, back before the heads shed, back with baskets, and a plan for storing what the sun braided into start. Predictable calories are a new kind of shelter. Under their roof, the shape of risk changes. Begin with the calendar. Hunters once kept their dates in the mussels when the calves drop on the high meadows, when the fish run silver in a morning flood. Farmers keep dates in dirt and sky. They watch the shoulder of the hill where snow lingers 2 weeks longer. The first cricket when evening cools, the hush that falls over reeds a night before rain. A woman presses a seed with her thumb into damp soil and marks the day with a notch on a stick. 40 days later, she tests a grain between teeth and hums the tune her mother used if it cracks clean. The sickle comes out. Songs become clocks. Clocks become harvests. Harvests become bin. A bin, however humble, is time in a pile. Storage reshapes the camp's skeleton. Instead of the easy architecture of move and go, houses grow ribs stout enough to hold a season on their backs. Poles are set in regular ranks. Mud walls are plastered with chaff and handprints. A raised floor lifts baskets out of the reach of damp and rats. Larders teach patience. Clay jars sealed with resin. Pits lined with straw and capped with a lid of earth that reads, to the casual eye, as just another piece of ground. A child learns to step carefully, lest a heel print give away food to a clever stranger. A teenager learns to listen for the faint papery scrape of mouse feet, an early warning that an entire month of winter might be at risk. The enemy is no longer only hunger, it is spoilage, theft, fermentation too eager for its own good. Against these, the group appoints new guardians whose bodies need not be strongest, but whose vigilance must be unblinking. Work orchestrates itself around grain's moods. Dawn, irrigation cuts are cleared, so water walks where roots can drink. Midday, weeds pulled, not all, not to a shine, just enough to tilt odds. Evening, a circle of hands rubs seed heads into baskets and sings to keep the rhythm kind to skin. Men and women, children and elders. The verbs rearrange. The fastest runner matters less than the person who knows the one place where a channel overflows and undermines a wall after 3 days of hard sun. The surest spear matters less than the surest knot on a granary door. New excellence blooms in wrists and eyes that would have been ordinary on the chase. With storage comes surplus, and with surplus come rolls. A potter's 10 fine jars keep the village through a gray week. A weaver's thick mat saves a roof under hail. A counter's knack for tallying sacks and portions lowers the rumor that gnaws a community at night. Is there enough? The counters scratch lines on clay, notch bones. Drop pebbles in a jar tokens that say, this is ours, this much is owed, this many days remain. Fairness ceases to be a feeling only. It becomes a record. In a pin, records are as warm as cloaks. This rebalancing of skills bleeds into selection's ledger. In the old column, a narrow chest in a blizzard was a sentence. Now, a narrow chest can live under a good cloak, beside a steady hearth, behind a wall that keeps the worst wind out. In the old column, a hunter who limped would starve without strangers' pity. Now, a limping farmer can plant and weed and teach. And a limping miller can be the one person whose hands feel. When stone greets stone at the just so distance that makes flowers sing rather than scorch. Genes still whisper their small biases into body, but the environment built from mud, straw, and custom speaks louder. Survival decouples from peak athletic fitness and couples more tightly to belonging inside reliable systems. Skeptics will raise their hands, and they are right to do so. Stored food rot, crowded bodies transmit coughs. Fields anchor the feet, where once freedom to move was a defense. Famine does not vanish. It arrives in new shape. A dry month can erase a year of work. A swarm can eat a season in an afternoon's shadow. Yet even here, culture bends the curve. Granaries are spread 3 small ones rather than 1 large, so a single fire cannot gut a village's winter. Fields are staggered by soil and aspect, so that a mist rain everywhere at once becomes rarer. And alliances are written in substances that travel. Jars of grain sent as bride wealth to bind 2 settlements' luck. Beer fermented and shared at planting and at harvest, to renew a promise that if your bins are empty in a star-thin month, our barn doors will open. Animals step closer to the fire and change the math again. Goats become moving banks. Cattle, slow as cloud, store summer in their flanks and give it back in milk that warms a child's belly in a freeze that would once have taken a life. Children who could not chew tough grain, yet sip sweetness they would have missed. Somewhere, an adult drinks without stomach pain and notices hours later. Not hours spent in the bushes. Somewhere else, nothing but cramp. The difference is not moral but genetic, over generations and geographies. The habit becomes a trait in certain peoples. Milk past weaning, a valve left open where it once closed. It is a small, local edit, a settings change in a body whose frame hardly shifts. The village, where this edit helps, will carry more well-fed children into spring. In the first towns, the air itself changes. Smoke rises from many chimneys. Waste must be managed, or it will manage the people. Ditches are dug not for water alone, but for filth. Pots are set aside for ashes to sweeten sour places. A woman learns to boil water when the river runs thick after rain. A man learns to carry his night soil past the ditch line for a plot that needs the gift. We see the beginnings of sanitation, not from theory but from repetition. Fewer fevers after this practice, more fevers when we forget. Law will come later, and temples and tablet. But the first statutes wear apron. Do it this way because last winter proved it. Trade now walks in caravans, fat with wants and answers. Salt out, cloth in her. Stone out, resin in. Grain out in a year of plenty. Dried fish in when the river betrayed. Tokens shell, stamped lumps of clay. Lengths of dyed cord travel with them. A person with a weak back can be a broker and keep 2 valleys from starving each other out of pride. A person with poor night vision can be the one who reads the tally by day and stops a quarrel with the shine of a bead. Fitness, if we must still use the word, stretches to include whoever helps the system hold. In the bone record, the changes are mixed and honest. Jaws show the wear of pounding grain. Spines arch the story of baskets carried and fields bent over. Childhood lines of stress do not vanish. They sometimes multiply when a field fails and a village cannot move. But something else appears beside the strain. Numbers swelling past what a wild landscape could have fed. Graves with goods that speak of people living long enough to hoard beauty. Healed injuries that say someone else weeded your rose while you lay still. The chassis remains familiar. Our kind does not sprout new joints for plows or a second stomach for straw. The shift is externalized. Tools, timetable, wall, rules, a softer ledger fill, rituals for redistributing risk. In one settlement, a harvest feast taxes abundance into obligation. You eat and you promise. Your name is sung and so is your debt. In another, a ring of standing posts holds knotted cords that anyone may add to when they take more than average from the bins. No one cuts the cords. No one reads them aloud. They simply accumulate, a visible conscience that leans a community toward balance. In a third, the oldest tell stories of the year the bins went to 0 and a neighbor's ox plowed their ground anyway next spring. Children hearing these tales learn the coordinates of generosity, the way they learn the creek's fords. If you are listening in the dark and tracing the arc with a fingertip, notice where it bends, from survival as a duel between body and season, to survival as a pact between bodies bound by systems. A weak ankle limits a sprint. It does not stop a ledger. A kill, a canal. A broad chest fills fast with air and lifts heavy sacks. So does a narrow chest that knows which sacks to move first because the rain will come from the east tonight. The genes for fast twitch and slow twitch still shuffle in the cradle. Above them, the village chooses who wakes the mill, who mends the weir, who watches the sky at dusk. Selection, the loud kind, grows quieter. The chorus of arrangements grows loud. Let the last image be the sound of grain on a roof. In the last heat of autumn sun, a family tosses handfuls into the breeze. Chaff lifts and wanders. Kernels rain back with a crispness like small bells. A child runs a hand through the pile and feels as surely as any hunter felt the bowstring sing, the promise folded in that weight. Mornings that will start with warm porridge, afternoons that will end with a heel of bread and a smear of sweetness. Winters counted not only in breaths, but in measured bowls. The work is endless. The work is enough. In its shadow, more kinds of body, more kinds of mind. Find room to live and to teach. A village becomes a town when the air forgets how to be alone. Smoke rises from many hearths at once. Dogs learn a new grammar of corners. Paths press themselves into streets and, eventually, into thoughts. With towns come systems agreements so practiced they feel like weather, and each system is a cushion slipped between people and the raw edges of chance. The old selection pressures still murmur, but their volume drops under the hum of baker, sweeper, counter, watchman, midwife, potters, scribe. Start with water, because towns live or cough by it. A ditch is dug not only to bring flow to gardens, but to carry filth away from bedrooms. The ditch learns rule. It must tilt just so, neither lazy nor hurried. It must be cleared after a storm. It must turn before the well so tongues do not drink what feet decided to forget. Children are scolded for playing where the runoff darkens. A boy spends a day lugging baskets because he tipped a chamber pot where the die makers rinse their claw. None of this is law written in stone yet. It is the repetition of common sense until it grows a spine. Then, quietly, the counting begins to matter more than anyone expected. In a small granary, shell tokens won for a sack, a larger for a cart, are slipped into clay envelopes and baked shut with a stamp. To open is to audit. To match is to trust. A woman who can keep 5 trades alive in her head without a pebble becomes prized. Her niece learns the knack and hums under her breath when the market is loud. Amid the hum, fairness is no longer only a feeling. It is a shape in clay, a braid of knot, a line of tally marks that can be pointed at when a voice grows hot. Disputes cool faster when both sides can touch the record. Specialization thickens the stew. A man whose wrist is steady becomes the favorite extractor of aching teeth. A woman whose ear knows baby's lungs becomes the midwife whose name is sung when labor begins. A boy with a sweet patience for edges turns out blades that hold, and learns to trade one fine knife for 2 sacks of millet and a promise of winter firewood. In the chase, a generalist had to do everything well enough. In the town, a web carries the weight. You do a few things very well, and the web gives back bread, shoes, pot, rest. That web is selection's cushion. Bodies that would have been outpaced in the open can now thrive because their hands fit a niche. The town value. Listen to the day's music. Morning, millstones speak in low, reassuring thunder as grain becomes meal. Midday, the rhythm of mallets at the tannery, the softer chorus of loom, the whisper of reeds as brooms chase dust toward the door. Evening, the watch's call at the gate, a crier naming tomorrow's market, a temple bell inviting silence long enough to remember you are not only hand. Each sound is a wire in the net that holds risk at arm's length. If one workshop burns, there are 3 more. If one baker falls ill, another opens early. Writing arrives hesitant, then everywhere and with it, a second kind of memory, the kind that does not need a throat. At first it is crude, marks for barley, marks for jars, tally lines for sheep that went out and sheep that came back. Then the marks learn to speak names and verbs. A narrow reed learns to press wet clay into syllables that carry astonishingly. Moo. A quarrel becomes a contract. A promise that once required 2 witnesses and a good pair of ears now fits into a tablet the size of a hand. A scribe with clean nails and a neat bite to his letters can make strangers honest at 10 paces and 10 months. He is not stronger than the hunter. He is a different answer to survival. Law sidles in wearing the clothes of custom. Do not tip ashes in the alley, says a sign scratched into plaster near a doorway. And a woman smiles because she wrote it after 3 small fires. In one winter, scared the street into wisdom. Return the tool you borrowed before the moon turns, says another. And the boy whose hands are always busy learns to mark time in debts as well as in sunset. Judges, elders with trimmed beards and long memories sit on benches with their sticks across their knees and mutter the sentences everyone knows. Pay double for a broken promise. Pay with your back if you can't pay with your purse. Stay away from the well at night unless you are on watch. Cruelty fidgets under such eyes. It shrinks when rules make it show its face in public. Sanitation, not a pretty word, but a warm one, turns disease from fate to management. A woman who boils water after flood learns by repetition that fewer fevers visit her courtyard. Neighbors notice. A midwife who insists on clean hands before touching a newborn earns the right to insist on other things. A quiet room, a covered pot of coals, the door shut against draft. Warehouses lay sweet herbs under grain to discourage beetles. Butchers keep the offal pit downslope. Soap appears, crude and miraculous, and a boy comes home from the tannery smelling faintly of the forest rather than like an old boot. Each little measure is a thread. Together they stitch a barrier between a city and the easy spread of cough and cholera. Markets are choreography and memory expressed in goods. A simple rule: their weights must balance. Measures must match ripples outward. Scales are checked by a guild that finds a cheat with public laughter and chastened if needed. A day at the gate wearing a sign that reads, "Asked the measure to lie." The humiliation is the point. A lie that dents food undermines the street's trust more than a lie that dents pride. Trust, conserved carefully, becomes wealth spread thin enough that everyone tastes some with that thin spread. The town can carry more kinds of people: slow runners, quiet thinkers, hands that shake except when stitching. A child is born into a cradle that civilization has woven. The midwife knows how to turn a breach. The neighbor knows which herb brought a fever down last winter. The potter made a vessel she can hold with one hand when the other holds the baby. The cobbler made soft shoes for feet that will kick straws soon. If an illness comes anyway, there is someone at the end of the lane who has seen this cough 3 times and knows it stays 7 days. Unless you keep the room cool and the patient quiet, the child has a better chance. Not because their bones are different, but because 1,000 small rehearsals have become custom, and custom bore. Steady. Kind said, "Do it this way." We've learned why. Walls rise, yeah, and they keep arrows out. But the softer walls matter more. Lines painted on a lane to keep carts to one side. A rule that no fire may be left alone. A rhythm of watch shifts that means eyes pass the night like a torch hand to hand. These are habits you barely notice until a season fails and the town does not. In a famine year, ration tokens replace grumbling. The temple opens its door not as charity, but as a scheduled release that keeps fights from starting. Mendicants sweep the square for a heel of bread and receive one, because the city prefers organized mercy to unmeasured desperation. Writing grows teeth and tenderness both. A debtor carves a mark that says he will pay after harvest and sleeps because the tablet holds his promise until his hands can. A widow points to her late husband's sign on a contract and receives the measure of grain owed without having to wrestle from a stronger man who misses the old rules. A child learns to scratch letters on a wax board. He is slow at running, but quick at marks, and soon he is the one a caravan leader seeks at the gate. His body would have lost a race across the plain. His wrist wins one across a season. Not everything improves. Crowding breeds quarrels. Smoke stings eye. A cough spreads faster when mouths share the same courtyard. Sometimes the ditch fills, and no one clears it, and the town remembers with a shudder why the rules exist. But the trend, read over lifetime, is a damping of the old brutalities. Accidents still happen. They are more often survivable. Shortages still bite. They are more often managed. A flood still comes. The wall holds most years, and in the year, it does not. A row of boats waits ready because a bored watchman nagged the council for new ropes each spring. Stand in your mind. At dusk on a town's flat roof, the air smells of bread and smoke and a little tannin from the dyer's vats. In the street below, someone argues about a goat that ate a garden. The argument pauses when a crier announces that tomorrow's market will be longer, because the caravan from the north arrived early. A woman leans on the parapet and counts the lamps punching holes in the falling dark. Each one is a family, a pot, a set of rules, a willingness to hold to them. Each one is a tiny hearth inside the larger hearth of the town. If you listen closely, you can hear selection itself change key from a solo hard on the throat to a choir that carries weak voices along. The song is not always pretty. It is, most night, enough. Bones are shy storytellers. They keep what they can: angles, thicknesses, the sturdy compromise of a pelvis that must both walk and birth, and let the rest drift away with the soft tissues that argued and decided and remembered. When we lay many bones in a row across time, what appears after our long winter is not a dramatic new chassis, but a familiar silhouette. Faces, foreheads, fingers already recognizably ours, well before the ash, persist with small variation. Regional accents more than new languages. In the museum drawer, labels change. The outlines do not shout. If we listen with patience, the quiet message is the most aggressive sculptor stepped back. The finer carver's culture, custom care took more of the commission. Picture a workroom behind the glass cases, where light falls like linen across tables. A curator in soft gloves lifts a cranium and sets it beside another from centuries later and a continent away. Calipers clit, vault height, mastoid breadth, nasal aperture, dental arcade. The differences are there, of course they are. But they are shy and tangled with migration and drift. The curator hummed, not with excitement exactly, but with the sober pleasure of continuity. She notes healed lesion, enamel hypoplasias that mark childhood stress, joint lipping that tells of loads carried or fields worked. The bones say plenty about lives. They are quieter about a species rewriting its blueprint. The older pages of our book already showed a modern template, chins tucked forward modestly, brow ridges softened, brains housed in globes more ballooned than low vault after the bottlenecked winters and the long climb into villages and towns. Those templates remain legible, with no bold new stroke. There are local edits. Yes, the face narrows here. The dental crowding increases there. Nasal passages adjust with climate, as they have always done. But we do not see the sort of directional march that cold and scarcity once enforced on other creatures, where saber-toothed cousins grew ever more extreme canines until the curve itself became a trap. We settled into a morphology that held steady enough to let something else do the changing. Walk in your thought. Into a teaching collection where students practice reading skeletons the way musicians practice scale. They learn the pelvis first, the cradle that tells sex more reliably than the skull. The opening whose compromise is the signature of our kind's two commitments, upright walking and lard. Slow-grown brain. Here, says the instructor, tracing the sciatic knot. You can see the allowance for birth. The notch does not widen century by century as cities rise. Birth remains a narrow negotiation. And so culture builds midwifery, birthing stools, rules about quiet rooms and warm hands, where bone does not change. Institutions do. Teeth carry another chapter. Their crowns record childhood's feast and famine ledger in faint lines. Their Weirs speaks to diet and habit. In forager graves, enamel edges are often honed by grit and fibrous plants. In early farmers, carbohydrated films and crowding become more common visitors, and later, in town, sweetness leaves its soft, drilling signature. But in the arrangement of teeth inside the jaw, we find only modest shift. Not the wholesale remodeling a strong new pressure might demand. A sweet new food arrives. Culture invents rinses, rule, tool, and eventually doctors who pull and fill. Our species' solution to sugar is not a new molar, but a marketplace and a clinic at the joints. Stories deepen, knees polish with miles walked and fields pace. Shoulders groove with the repetition of lifting jars and turning millstones. Spines curve under baskets that make a childhood strong and a middle age ache. But the basic hinge and ball architecture remains the same compromise between range of motion and stability that served on coastal shelves and now serves in courtyards. If the environment had demanded, over and over, only sprinting bodies, we might have seen narrower chests and longer distal limbs sweep a population. If it had insisted ceaselessly on powerlifters, broader attachments and deeper chests might have crept across the mat. Instead, the environment became many environments woven by plans, coats and kiln, calendars and canals. The selection gradient that once pushed hard on bodies diffused into systems that asked for skills before they asked for new bones. Brains hide their own tail, and we must treat it with velvet gloves. Endocasts. Sewn copies of inner skulls refuse to gossip loudly about thought. Average cranial volume. Plotted carefully and argued over endlessly. Do not draw a simple arrow upward across these millennia. Some samples suggest slight decreases here or there. Others show stability tucked inside migration and mixture. Instead of an easy morale, we are left with a different kind of clarity. Whatever the cubic centimeters, the minds inside these steady skulls were increasingly extended by the second world, by writing and roads, guilds and gossip, rituals and rule. Collective intelligence swelled without demanding more casing. It borrowed shelves outside the bone. It helps to remember that stasis is not nothing. In paleontology, a long, flat line can be as telling as a sudden spike. It says a design met many tests and did not fail them. Not because nothing changed, but because the pressures changed shape. A camp that feeds a child through a fever without asking legs to grow longer has changed selection. A town that keeps water clean by rule rescues kidneys without evolving new filters. A market that feeds poor eyesight with a scribe's wages and a potter's bread keeps alleles in circulation that would otherwise have dimmed. Slow rain raised the river not by carving banks, but by lifting the whole plain. In this light, the exceptions glow properly as exception. A high plateau, thin air. Hard sun tugs on hemoglobin chemistry and its regulators. A milk-rich economy rewards bodies that keep making lactase. A malaria wetland favors sickle traits in carriers. These are sharp local chisels, still working the stone. Undeniable and instructive, but they sit atop a frame that does not race away from its prior shape. They are updates, not new operating systems. Patches released by specific valleys and diets and insects, not sweeping mandates from winter. There is a temptation to turn this steadiness into slogan. We stopped evolving. It is better. Kinder to truth and to sleep, to say that our strongest selection shifted media. Where climate once wrote hard notes in bone, culture began annotating in ink and habit. Where predation once rewarded sprint or stealth, now agreements reward patience, fairness, teachability. The bone record reflects the truce. Fewer signatures of relentless directional pressure. More signatures of lives lived long enough to leave healed stories. Evolution did not halt at a signal. It entered a quieter key. One we can hear only if we listen to bodies and customs together. Let a small room hold the closing image. A museum drawer slides open on felt, and a row of mandibles looks up like punctuation marks. A child on a field trip peers over the edge and sees nothing change from left to right, but the faint staining of soil and a few wear patterns. She is disappointed for a breath and then transfixed when the docent tells her what those jaws imply. Soups that kept fevers fed. Laws that kept wells clean. Midwives whose names did not fossilize, but whose hands echo here. Songs that paced work, so joints wore slowly enough to make grandmothers. Bones are the quietest, the docent says, and she points to a healed break with a fingertip. They whisper what culture shouted. The child nods without quite knowing why. We do. The outline of us held, while the inside of our days changed beyond all earlier imagining. Brains are greedy fires. They burn a fifth of the body's fuel even when the body is still. And children's brains burn more, as if they were small cities lit all night. For a long stretch before the ash-dark winters, those fires grew within us. Skulls ballooned compared with our older cousins. Foreheads rose into theaters where ideas could play. Afterward, when we read the record with careful fingers, we do not find an arrow that keeps shooting upward. We find something subtler, a stable state, a ceiling with hairline edit, perhaps even modest declines here and there, depending on the place and sample. The mind's reach kept lengthening, but not by building new rooms inside the skull. It lengthened by annexing the world outside the bone, by wiring people to people, people to tools, tools to rule. Imagine two camps at dusk. In the first, the brightest thinker sits a little apart, hoarding hunches like acorns. In the second, a dozen ordinary minds trade small certainties until they form a chain long enough to cross a river. The second camp gets more done. Cumulative culture, the habit of storing improvements, so the next hand starts higher turns. Average minds into a collective instrument that surprises even itself. Language stacks ideas. Imitation copies the stack. Institutions pin the stack in place so it cannot fall over after one bad season. A village ledger, a guild tradition, A recipe that never forgets the pinch of ash in the clay in all our memory palaces built where firewood is cheap and sugar plentiful, not in the skull, but in the street. If we peel back the museum label and talk about meat and breath, the trade-off makes sense. Big brains are costly. They demand long childhoods and steady calories. They complicate birth. They force compromises at the pelvis and the larynx. In a world where information can be externalized, taught, written, standardized evolution has room to ease off the gas without dimming the headlights. You do not need every child to reinvent the wheel if the village teaches it. You do not need every adult to be a card of encyclopedias if the market square holds specialists whose mouths are open to questions. Energy saved in one skull can feed 2 more infants through a lean month. Selection smiles softly on thrift that does not harm survival. Scholars argue their job is to argue about cranial volumes in the last 10 or 12,000 years. Some data sets suggest slight average reductions in particular regions. Others show stasis braided with migration. Still others point out that body size shifted, too, and brains scale with bodies like lungs and livers do. The careful phrasing for bedtime is this: there's no simple mark where we glimpse decreases. Plausible stories gather diet changes, body size changes, an economy that rewards patience and cooperation over constant hypervigilance. Even a gentle self-domestication in which temperaments tilted toward lower reactive aggression, because towns punish brawlers and favor those who can wait. Share and persuade. None of these tales is settled. Together they hum a note. The mind's power flowered in networks more than in sheer bulk. Think of the ways the skull was relieved of storage. Knots keep numbers, beads keep credit, tallies keep flocks honest. Later, scratches on clay keep promises for months. Reed pens keep wheat counted by the cartload. Eventually, paper keeps centuries inside a box that a child can lift. Far from making us lax, these external shelves made us more ambitious, freed from recalling every step. Minds could rehearse contingencies, errands, melody. A potter did not have to remember every firing's weather if she could mark a tablet with the day's wind. She could reserve her attention for the breath of flame just before a pot sings safe. A sailor did not have to carry the coastline in his head if he had a chart. He could give his mind to storms and crew and the politics of harbors. Sociality is hardware as much as software. Our Dunbar number. The loose capacity to track a few dozen deep ties and a couple hundred faces did not need to double for cities to work. Cities hacked it. They created roles and badges and uniforms, so strangers could be read as if they were kin in a particular domain. This cloth means baker. This stamp means guild member. This dialect means a clan that keeps oath. Gossip so often scolded became a routing protocol for trust. Rituals synced hearts so cooperation could start unbeaten. Markets standardized weights, so fairness did not require mind reading. The cognitive load of life spread outward across signage, schedules, and shared stories until one person could navigate a day that would have crushed a solitary genius. Inside the skull, selection may have trimmed peaks and fattened the middle. A population with fewer hair-triggered tempers is easier to govern and feed. A population with more plasticity, more learners who can become scribes or shepherds or sailors on demand outcompetes one with a few dazzling outliers and many brittle specialists. Patience, teachability, impulse-controlled traits that leave soft traces in bones sat closer to the center of the new contest. Towns jail the easily enraged. Contracts punish the chronically deceitful. Festivals reward those who can delay private wants for shared crescendos. The brain's wiring diagram did not have to be redrawn to nudge temperament. Tiny shifts in development and hormone, spread thinly across thousands of births, can change the weather of a populace's mood. Dreams help. 2. That sounds poetic until you listen like an engineer. Sleep consolidates memory. REM stitches unrelated scraps into tentative maps that sometimes yield what if in daylight. A people who can afford long, safe nights because walls and watches and customs buy quiet will dream more and remember better. They will wake with more patterns to test gently at the workshop bench. The city's defenses expand cognitive space not only by day, with libraries and schools, but by night with unbroken sleep. We should talk about error correction. Because culture's advantage is not just storage, it is revision. Genes cannot edit last year's baby. Laws can edit last year's mistake. A canal that silted in March can be dredged deeper by April. A plague that spreads by touch can teach a city to wash hands before anyone knows the first microbe's name. Institutions run the tight loop between noticing and updating. The brain's tight loop is slower. Mutation, recombination, selection, time. By putting more of our fate in systems that can version their own rules, we stepped onto a staircase. Evolution alone could never have built in a single lifetime. None of this means individual brilliance vanished or became unimportant. A blade form, a shatterproof glaze. A notation for lengthening song, these still begin in particular head. But watch how quickly a good idea now escapes its skull. A journeyman leaves with a new technique. A caravan carries a rumor 1,000 miles. A scribe copies an improvement into a manual for the apprentices of next spring. The collective brain grows richer with population and connectivity, not because every person got smarter, but because more combinations could be tried and kept. Even when a war knocks shelves down, enough copies remain in enough places for the pattern to be restored. If you want a single image for the shift, think of clay tablets lined in a storeroom. Each is only a hand's worth of mark. Together they let a river city plan plantings, schedule dredger, ration barley, when an upstream neighbor keeps too much, and find the cheaters who shave their measure. The skull across the room, that of the clerk who made half of these marks, houses a brain no larger than his grandfather's. Yet his city feeds 10,000 mouths and recovers from floods that would have emptied small bands forever. Intelligence did not ascend only in one bright tower. It tiled the landscape. Caution, as ever. Some populations took hard detours, famines that swelled heads with water and darkened rooms for a generation. Raids that made trauma a family heirloom. Migrations that mixed groups faster than customs could cushion the friction. Local anatomies answered local drum. Tibet learned to breathe thin air without thick blood. Islanders learned to paddle genealogies across horizons. Pastoralists shaped minds to calendars of grass and worry. The chorus still holds the melody. The human outline remained steady, while the score around it grew intricate enough that bones seem almost left behind by the song. Hold a lass. Small scene. A child in a scriptorium traces letters with a reed. He is not quick with numbers and will never be the best at lifting sacks, but he has a patience that keeps lines straight and a pleasure in small perfections. A curve finished cleanly, a margin kept true. Beside him, a basket of tablets waits, each a promise someone else made. He will help the town remember itself through winter. Under his skull, an ordinary brain hum. Around his skull, shelves, lawn, guild oaths, and the murmured discipline of a quiet room turn that hum into a city's memory. The candle gutters. He shields it with his hand and keeps writing. The light is tiny. The reach is wide. Cold rooms hold warm truth. In a basement lab lit like winter, even at noon. Freezers exhale white breath when their doors open. Labeled bones. Petrous portions of temporal bones that cradle inner ears. Teeth sealed against centuries come out briefly, then vanish again behind doors that chime if left ajar. In another room, a technician moves like someone shushing the air. She strips away the last clinging soils with a brush the size of an eyelash, then powders a fragment that used to hear a world we only imagine. Surf, fire, the laughter of a cousin. Machines hum, reading letters that once anchored those sounds. C, G, T like a tide coming in for the second time. Ancient DNA is a slow, exacting tenderness. You work in gowns and masks. Not because bones are dangerous, but because your breath is. A single modern cell can shout over 1,000,000 ancient whispers. Inside clean hoods, regents coax molecules to peel their stories off mineral scaffold. And then the sequencer, a tidy beast with patient eye, turns cycles of chemistry into files that look like long, stuttering phone calls from the past. The calls are patchy. Time has gnawed at the vowels. Water has blurred the consonants, but enough comes through to hear a pattern that was once only inference. We are not the lone children of a straight line. We are a braid. When the first good genomes arrived from people who lived 45,000 years ago, the news had two lights in it. One was familiarity, the scaffolding so much of it looked like ours. The other was a chorus of faint extras, like harmonics when a string is tuned, stretches that match the old neighbors whose bones had their own stories. Neanderthal, Denisovan, cousins we once treated like footnotes, but who now sit at the table inside us. The admixture is not a rumor. It is written crosswise in the grain. A few percent here, a whisper there. Sometimes a gift you can point to with a fingertip. A haplotype that braces the immune system. A tweak in how the body senses oxygen at altitude. A pigment pathway nudged by a variant that rode in on a visit's warm breath. The old headline, "We replaced them," tarnishes under this light. We met them, loved or fought or both, and some of them stayed, is closer and kinder to what the molecules say. Go back further, through the ash, into nights when our kind saw fire in other eyes, not entirely like our own. Picture a narrow valley where winter sits longer than it should. A small bandar skirts a ridge and finds a camp in a shallow cave. The stranger's fire smells the same. Their tools carry a different rhythm. Their faces are both familiar and new, in a way we would only later name. The first conversation is not about theory. It is about what and game, and whether the wind is about to turn mean. A shared word for cold land, and something unwrites loneliness by 2 degrees. Weeks later, a child with a broad, patient face laughs in a way both bands recognize. We tell such stories not to embroider what cannot be proven about single meetings, but to make room inside our bedtime for the humility the molecules teach. Ancient people did not read species trees. They read one another, and sometimes the reading wrote children. From the lab, switch back to the open. The moccasin tracks that led to us left mixers behind. In Oceania, Denisovan's signals glow like embers carried far older, different, telling us that multiple meetings mattered. In Tibet, a variant whispers about air thin as prayer. In the Andes, another solution, homegrown, leans on different levers. A reminder that evolution is multiple choice, even when the question is the same. None of this redraws our outline into a new species. It sketches local footnotes under a single main text edits that help in specific rooms of the world's house, while the body of the book stays legible across continents and time. The surprising steadiness of the broader pages is its own message. Take a skeleton from a river terrace 1,000 winters ago and another from a town under an early wall. Lay their sequences beside one another, and the family resemblance is strong. There are drifted differences, and migrations make palimpsests where old lines ghost under new. But the dominant theme is continuity braided with mixing, groups moving in, out, through, alleles riding in on cart, on marriages, on the edges of quarrels that cooled into trade. The genome looks like a woven mat, replaced strand by strand until none of the original fibers remain. Yet the pattern, always patched, always slightly edited, stays readable. You can feel, if you blur your eye, the relaxed pressure we've been talking about. Fewer big sweeps pushing one variant to everywhere. More small waves lapping and mixing on many shores. Sweeps do happen. Lactase persistence in some herding peoples paints a bright streak. Malaria's sickle armor does its harsh accounting. Skin tone palettes adjust, often quickly, to latitudes and clouds. But the cinematic arrows, the ones that would take a population from one anatomical state to another over mere millennia, are rare. Instead, what rises are stories of selection leaning lightly, often locally, while culture does heavy lifting elsewhere. A coastal village adopts a new net and survival jumps without any change in hemoglobin. A city outlaws dumping refuse in the alley. And infant deaths drop without anyone evolving new kidneys. Laws and tools stand where once the wind and hunger stood. Back in the lab, the technician's gloved finger scrolls a screen that shows tiny spikes. Graphs that mean insertions here, deletions there. A recombination that shuffles a deck in a way a statistician later will treat like rain. If you zoom into a single site, the wonder is microscopic and fragile. If you zoom out, maps light up with arrows and dates. The caution we have kept beside us all night belongs here. Ancient DNA is a young ear. It sometimes mishears. Contamination, sampling bias, the luck of which bones yield whisperable libraries. These bend conclusions if you are not humble. The careful phrasing hold. Admixture is real. Continuity is strong. Selection is ongoing. Biology's noise floor lowered under culture's soft carpet. But the instruments still pick up local solos where the environment insists The ongoing matters because the lullaby version of We Stopped Changing flirts with a dangerous sleep. We never stopped. We changed the main theater. Genes still tune. They just do more interesting chamber music than marching band crescendos. The orchestra of culture plays loud and teaching and tamping and redistributing risk so that genomes can explore smaller, safer move. When a town weaves a safety net, variants that would have been culled by a hard winter get to stay and see what else they might be good for in a different play. That law. Soft experiment is visible now, not only in bones with healed stories, but in bases that sparkle with old meetings and new edits. Let the imagination slip back to the clean room corridor, where tape seals are checked with the tenderness of someone confirming a sleeping child is warm enough. A graduate student in 2 pairs of gloves sets a tiny tube into the sequencer's tray. Outside, evening lays a blue hand on the snow. Inside, Lee D's blink a language of patience while the cycles spin. She opens a notebook and copies yesterday's notes. With the neatness of someone who knows memory is brittle. Sample 23. She writes, yield low. Map damage consistent with ancient. Neanderthal ancestry 2%. Contamination estimate 1%. She closes the book and leans her forehead to the cool glass as if listening through it to a conversation the room has held for tens of thousands of years. In her pocket is a card from her grandmother with a recipe for bread written in a hand that wobbles now. Both notes are instructions for continuity. Both are ways to keep a pattern alive. This much water to flour, this much bleach to buffer. Wait, be gentle. The story those blinking lights help tell is a forgiving one. We are not the sum of one valley's disaster. We are not the purity some myths hunger for. We are, gloriously, a long relay of borrowings and lendings, meetings by rivers, covenants at hearth, nights of trade and nights of love, and mornings when a child's face looked like everyone and like no one. And the camp nodded. Yes, the genome, read with humility, agrees. It shows paths crossing, not wall. It shows edits upon a template that arrived early and lingered. Not a chassis remodeled wholesale by one storm. Before sleep, hold a last, gentle image. A beaker fogs under your breath. A string of letters prints across a screen. In a far valley, wind combs grass over a buried camp where a girl once laughed. The line from her to you is not straight. It is better than straight. It wanders and gathers. It includes neighbors who joined and voices that would be gone if care had not made a space at the fire. Ancient DNA is the lab's way of listening for that laughter in the bones. The answer, when we are quiet enough to hear it, is not a new jawline, but an old promise kept that people remembered each other, borrowed each other, and made a future even when the sky dimmed. The braid held. Milk is a kindness with conditions. For newborn, the door is open wide. The enzyme that breaks milk sugar lactase runs like a clear stream. In most mammals, that stream narrows after weaning. In many of us, long after camps became villages, it kept flowing, not everywhere, not all at once, but in pockets where animals stood near the fire, and a new calendar took shape around udders and grass. This is one of those bright exceptions that prove the quieter rule. The chassis hardly changed. A small valve's timing did. Walk with a herder before dawn. The stars are rinsing from the sky. And the camp is a geometry of low shadows, hurdles for kids, a ring for goats, a tighter ring for calves. A woman wakes a coal with a breath. A man loops a rope into a slip knot with one practiced hand. Hides creak. Hooves shift. The cows and goats settle into their stations as if a song had begun. The first squirts hit the pail with a music you can count by. A 3-beat measure that steadies hand. A child still too small for other work holds the tail away. Serious as a clerk. Steam rises from the pail. It smells like the inside of a warm morning. Milk changes risk because it is portable sunlight. Grass gathers light. Animals fold grass into liquid sweetness. Humans sip the sun on cold days. Infants who might have failed in a bad harvest live through winter on another creature's patience. Women worn thin by a lean season find their cheeks filling again when goats kid at the edge of frost. But milk is also a test. In many bodies, the sugar in it, lactose, ferments uncomfortably beyond childhood. Bellies cramp. Afternoons become long. Cultures found a workaround before genes did. They soured milk on purpose. Yogurt, kefir, sour curds, hard cheeses. Each is a technology that eats the sugar first, leaving protein and fat to go gently into the gut. A clay strainer with a film of old milk in its pores is a machine disguised as pottery. It turns no into maybe, and maybe into most days, yes, somewhere, more than once. A different workaround happened in the body. A change near the gene that manages lactase didn't switch off at weaning. It kept the stream running. In a few valleys and plains, where herds were banks and grass was currency, children who could drink raw milk after weaning had a small, repeating edge. They grew through lean months, recovered from fevers fast, weaned earlier without losing ground. Their sibling, cousins, and the cousins of their cousins carried the same quirk. Over generations, the local ledger tilted. The trait spread, not as a flood, but as a creek that finds all the low places. In other grassland, another change. Similar job, different letters arose and did the same. The story repeats in different scripts. Northern plains and eastern grassland. Cattle and camels, goats and sheep. The melody is local, the harmony familiar. Picture an afternoon under an awning of woven reed. More reed in a summer-cured village on the table. Clay bowls hold white drift. Fresh cheese salted lightly so it will last the week. A jug of tangy yogurt cool in a sleeve of wet cloth. A skin bag that will be shaken as the day goes on to churn butter from a beast that grazes within sight. An elder explains to a teenager the rules of keeping milk from souring too soon and of souring it just enough. Stir when the shade reaches the third post. Keep flies out with fennel smoke. Never lay the strainers flat, so puddles form and invite wrong guests. These rules are sensitivity baked into habit. Gene, here, are only one of the routes to comfort. Culture built the others, and built them fast. A herding life bends kinship and calendar. Families time births of calves and kids to match hungry human months. They move when pasture says so, not when the old hunting moon once did. Children learn the sound of contented cud, and the smell that warns a goat is near kidding and needs quiet. Men who once measured strength by a sprint now measure it by a steady walk beside animals for hours, and the hand that can soothe a skittish cow rather than force her. Women whose fingers sewed hoods now twist cheesecloths and judge curds by the way whey runs from a pinch. This is good milk weather, someone says, meaning grass, rain, and peace in the valley. The exception leaves signature on pottery buried in old middens. Residues carry the ghost of fats that came from milk, not from meat or marrow. In skeletons of herding peoples, children's bones speak of steady protein through years when wild cousins may have known gaps. Yet the bones also remind us that dairying is not a magic shield. Crowding animals brings coughs closer. Hands that milk and then cook without washing pass fevers. Communities answer with more custom, designated milking cloths kept separate, washing songs that set the right length for scrubbing. Taboos about who may enter the milking circle and when, partly to keep animals calm, partly to keep sickness predictable. The choreography is a public health that does not know its own name. It is tempting to make the trait a parable that runs too cleanly. We learn to herd, we evolve to drink. Better to keep the story honest and textured. In some milk-rich places, many adults digest raw milk easily. In others, nearly none do. And yet, dairying thrives through fermentation, straining, and timing. Households mix strategies within the same fence. A grandfather drinks fresh. A grandmother takes hers as yogurt. A child eats soft cheese. A visiting cousin takes butter, and none of the rest. The economy of comfort is plural. Culture outruns genes where it must. Genes catch up where they can. Trade carries the habit further than any allele could run in a lifetime. A family in a grain valley far from herds acquires a taste for cheese and the knack for keeping it cool in a jar sunk to its neck in a north-facing wall. A caravan leaves a skin of sour milk in exchange for barley and a roof. The valley tries it, grimaces the first week, then learns when to stop the ferment for a gentler tang. Meanwhile, on the steppe, a young herder who cannot take milk without complaint learns to love a hard cheese shaved thin and melted into grain. Practices travel faster than variant. Comfort arrives in wagons long before it arrives in blood. The little gate in the gut that remains open is not a moral improvement. It is a setting changed to suit a neighborhood. The wonder is not that it changed, that is evolution's job, but that the change did not demand a redesign of the house, only a tweak to one hinge. Under that hinge, swung a door to a winter pantry. The hinge appears in DNA as a modest note near a gene switch. I'll leave this on scribble in the margin. Underneath, the larger handwriting of culture fills the page. The recipes, the rules, the timing, the tools. We can listen for how this exception plays inside Selection's choir, where raw milk drinking paid dividends season after season. Bodies that tolerated it joined more often in the naming of spring calves. Where milk was always sour, the edge narrowed. Culture leveled the playing field so thoroughly that many bodies never felt the pressure to change at all. In both places, the society survival rose on a pillow fluffed by a herd's breath. Children saw more winters. Mothers saw more children live to speak their names. Grandparents told longer stories. None of this required new cheekbones or a remodeled pelvis. It required attention paid to animals and to one another. Hold a brief scene at dusk. A woman sits with a girl and teaches her the moment to lift the ladle when making yogurt. Not when it coats like paint, she says, and not when it runs like water. When it clings like morning fog to a twig. The girl tests and laughs when she feels it. In a nearby pen, a calf noses a rope and sighs milk-sweet breath. Somewhere on a ridge, a boy runs with the herd and practices the whistle that turns them as if folding cloth. Beneath these gestures is a quiet evolutionary footnote. A valve's timer set later in life in this lineage, set earlier in that. Above them is the larger manuscript we have been reading all night. Culture composing comfort faster than bone can. Genes adding marginalia when the local library keeps the same book open for many years. There will be other exceptions, the thin air trick on the roof of the world. The different trick in the western mountain. Small edits around sugar and starch and sun. Each will be local, crisp, legible against the broad stasis of our shape. Each will hum the same refrain, where the world presses and culture cannot fully cushion. Bodies learn a small new way, where culture can cushion. It does, and bodies rest from the demand to change. Milk is simply a kind, clear case where we can see both fermentation as fast rescue, lactase persistence as the slower echo of a life lived within arm's reach of animals. Let that be the taste we carry into sleep. Warm milk sweetened with a little honey for a feverish child. A crumbly cheese shared on a road between strangers who become cousins by trade. A jug cooling in a clay sleeve while the afternoon hums. The exception glows, but it glows within the same gentle argument we have been making, that after the long winter, our species learned to place more and more of its bets on knowledge and on one another, letting genes make small, elegant edits while villages, songs, and hands did the heavy, loving work. Thin air turns breath into arithmetic. At sea level, lungs are casual accountants. On a plateau where the sky has fewer coins of oxygen to spend, every step asks for a receipt. People can visit with grit soldiers, pilgrims, traders, but to be born and to raise children, where the stars sit closer. Bodies need a different ledger. Here is one of our cleanest small edits. Not a new chest, not new wings, but a retuning of how blood listens to air. It happened more than once, in different high home, and the parallel is as instructive as the differences. Walk before dawn on a Tibetan meadow. Yaks huff steam. Prayer flags click their quiet language along a ridge. A woman stoops to light dried dung in a small stove and hums while a pot finds its balance. Her heart is not panicked. It is practice. The air is thin as a secret, yet her blood does not thicken into slud. In many lowlanders, the quick solution to height is to pour more hemoglobin into the river, useful for a few weeks, then dangerous, as the blood turns syrupy and strokes tap shoulders. In these high valleys, bodies learned a subtler trick. Keep the hemoglobin modest, but make the machinery that senses oxygen and sets responses more precise. The result is a steady life, where visitors wheeze. Cross in your mind to the Andes, where mountains wear snow like old kings, and towns perch in light so sharp it feels like a sound. The strategy here, in many communities, took a different path. Higher hemoglobin, chests slightly broader on average, rhythms that suit long steps on slope. The same problem, how to keep mother and fetus safe, how to raise a laughing child. Where the barometer shrugs, answered with another configuration. Parallel solutions, not clone. The tuning lives in pathways that biologists give tidy names. We can keep our bedtime voice and say it this way. There is a thermostat, deep in cell, that tells the body what enough oxygen feels like and how to respond when enough slips. In Tibetans, some of the dials on that thermostat carry versions that came, it seems, from an old neighbor, the kind of inheritance we met beside the freezer light earlier. Those versions damp the signal that would otherwise demand sludge blood. The plateau writes its edits not by carving a new rib, but by scribbling. Turn this down beside a switch. These are exceptions that prove a broader rule. They are crisp, local, measurable. They arose fast on the clock of evolution, thousands of years. Perhaps less for parts of the change, because the pressure was not one winter or 10, but every breath, every pregnancy, every childhood fever that might tilt into a bad blue if the signaling ran hot. When culture cannot fully cushion, no recipe ferments thin air, no law fattens the sky, genes take the pen more often. Where culture can help, it still does. Houses with low smoke holes to warm air without stealing oxygen. Work shared so no one carries loads at noon. Tea and soups that coax breath without stealing water. But the main negotiation here is cellular pregnancy. The great selector enforces the term at height. A mother's body must make a placenta that sips oxygen politely and shares it well. In families whose tuning matches the plateau, babies are born closer to sea-level weights. In those without the tuning, the risk of too small infants rises. A trait that saves infants will not whisper for long. It will be sung by statisticians and midwives alike. The lullaby is harsh but true. What helps babies thrive becomes common wherever babies need it. That is why the plateau's signature is clear, even when we keep language cautious about the exact letters and dates, because the world is messy. Costs come braided with benefits. Some highland adaptations that ease one risk can raise another. Blood that carries more oxygen may also carry more viscosity. Hearts that push hard all day may wear earlier in old age. Communities discover cultural counterweights. Slower work in hot seasons. Afternoon rests enshrined as custom rather than laziness. Herbs that ease headaches kept by the door. Rules about visitors ascending in stages. A ritual disguised as a clinical protocol. The body's small edits and the village's larger agreements meet like hands. If we zoom back to the museum drawer of skull, we still do not see a new species wearing a mountain. Cheekbones do not sprout fins. Pelvises do not grow new compromises. We see, instead, the same outline wearing a local song. The song leaves molecular sheet music inside cells and behavioral sheet music on the calendar. Plant potatoes early in this pocket. Harvest quinoa late in that. Chew coca leaf on this pass. Boil water always after that storm. The two scores DNA and custom harmonize into survival. There is a humility to carry from these heights. The clean examples tempt slogans. Evolution is alive and fast. Genes trump culture up there. The better sentence is braided. When a pressure presses every hour and cannot be diluted by tricks. Small genetic edits accumulate. When a pressure visits irregularly or can be redistributed by planning, culture does the bulk of the buffering. High plateaus offered both lessons at once. The stories of breath remind us that the quiet we have heard in bones elsewhere is not silence but room for culture to build shelters so soft-eyed infants can grow and sing. Hold a last spare image. Late afternoon on a ridge. Wind combing grass into one direction. A grandmother sits with a girl on a flat stone and teaches her how to breathe during work short in through the nose, longer out. A rhythm that matches steps so the world does not tilt. Listen to the hill, she says, and the girl learns that thin air has a tempo. Below them, a river spangles like hammered metal. Above them, the sky shows its bone. Inside them, small edits keep the blood from growing greedy. And older edit stories and rules keep effort from growing foolish. The plateau keeps its citizens by partnership, lungs and laws, valves and vow. The outline of us holds. The wind writes flourishes on the margin. Genes are carpenters who work with winter's patience. Culture is a street crew with lanterns who can repave a road before morning. The difference in tempo is the difference between a song learned by ear tonight and a bird whose call shifts over centuries. After the ash-dim years, our species began to place more wagers on the faster shot. We still carried hammers in the blood. Yet, but more and more, we leaned on tools, timetables, and talk on update cycles measured not in generations, but in market days and monsoon breaks. The net effect was a kind of fast selection, not on bones, but on behavior, stories, and structures. Good ways spread. Brittle ways snapped. The band survived by revising. Listen to how a small improvement moves in a valley of reeds. A fisher widens the throat of a basket trap by a thumb's width and tilts it 2 fingers more into the current. Catch double. He shows a cousin. By week's end, 3 families copy the trick. By season's end, it is the default. By next spring, someone else adds a stone tied to the downstream foot, so the trap steadies in space. A genetic sweep would require many births and burials. A cultural sweep takes 2 markets and a wedding. The trait under selection is not an allele, but an arrangement, one that yields calories under stress without asking anyone to grow a new joint. Institutions are culture's muscle memory. A single clever trap can vanish when a family moves. A rule set the stone. Widen the throat. Tie the first basket to the old. Keeps the improvement across winter. Rules are stubborn, not because they are written, but because they are rehearsed. A child learns them long before they can explain them. A teenager enforces them on a sibling without remembering their origin. An elder quotes them with a smile that says, "We tried skipping once. It went badly." Brains do not need to change wiring to keep this fidelity. They need only to belong to a rehearsal schedule. The pattern repeats at larger scale. A canal silts. This year the town dredges at the first fog, not the third. Flood damage halves. The mayor inscribes the new timing on a tablet and nails a copy to the warehouse door. Next year, even if the mayor is dead, the dredgers arrive by the calendar's command. The selected entity here is a line in clay. It persists because the city rewards those who obey the line and fines those who do not. Enforcement is a form of inheritance. The future receives the benefit because the present pays attention. Biology can neither decree nor collect such fines. Culture can. Markets run rapid experiments for free. 10 potters fire with different mixes. 1 glaze survives the salt air best. Buyers taught. Within a month, the better mix spreads along the coast. The worse ones shrink to niches, decorative pieces far from spread. Seb, or jars meant to store grain rather than brine. No potter's child changed their skull to make this happen. The selection pressure was wallet and word of mouth. The trait under test was a recipe. The heritability lived in hands and habit. When the sea shifts its tantrums, the recipe shifts again because flexibility is built in. Genetic change cannot pivot on such short notice without luck. Culture schedules pivots for late afternoon. Writing accelerates the loop further by separating memory from meat. You can teach a trick to someone who will never meet you by pressing reeds into clay. Across distance, a bright idea does not need a caravan of masters, only a durable medium and a reader. A ledger notes that last winter's rationing scheme kept tempers cool. A manual cautions that resin must be warmed away from open flame. A treaty lists the markers along a boundary so armed men can point to a tablet instead of to blood. The city's genome becomes a library. Modules that can be duplicated, patched, deprecated, forked. The best modules are versioned. As amended in the year of short barley, says a preface in neat script, and a child practicing the alphabet absorbs not only letters, but the habit of revision. Networks amplify this fast selection with combinations no single village could test. 2 river towns learn different tricks. A peddler carries them both. A third town tries both at once and discovers a synergy. The idea behaves like a gene in the sense that it replicates, mutates, and competes. But it behaves unlike a gene in its speed and intentionality. People choose, argue, and measure. They keep notebooks. They reward early adopters who are right and gossip about early adopters who burn down a shed. The feedback arrives in days. The correction arrives before the next moon. Even morality, often framed as timeless, evolves on this fast track. A practice that breeds riots is selected against by councils who prefer sleep. A ritual that binds strangers into cousins is selected for by merchants who count profit in calm returns. Do not tip ashes in the alley begins as a plea from a neighbor whose thatch singed. Becomes a norm after 3 singes. Becomes a fine after 1 blaze. Becomes, in time, common sense so firm. No one recalls paying the first fine. Temperaments that fit these norms prosper because the norms are enforced. The brain's wiring for impulse can remain as various as ever. The city channels impulses through rules that feed bread to patience and cuffs to brawls. Over centuries, a slow biological lean towards softer temper may follow. But even if it never did, the fast selection at the level of policy and practice would keep the peace most years. Tools evolve too, but they do so with debugging. A spear point breaks at the haft seam. The maker scratches a notch pattern on the next to remind himself to bind higher. Apprentices copy the notch along with the geometry. That notch is metadata data about the tool, not the task. And metadata is how culture remembers mistake. Genes remember by losing. Culture remembers by writing and teaching. This is why the collective brain can be both conservative and quick. Conservative in keeping what works, quick in patching what fails. We are, as a species, brilliant maintainers. Risk is redistributed by this system, the way heat is redistributed by weather. A lean harvest in one ward becomes ration tickets rather than graves. A fire becomes a brigade drill rather than an era's name. A plague becomes a hand-washing song rather than a lineage's extinction. Everywhere culture can intercept hazard, it does. And selections bite on anatomy dulls, where hazard cannot be intercepted thin air. Ancient parasites with clever life cycles. Genes still take their turns at the wheel. The resulting map is modeled. Broad plains of stasis in bone. Bright islands of adaptation in blood chemistry and digestion, with trade winds of custom blowing between them. Consider apprenticeships as inheritance with checksum. A potter learns not only to raise a wall and pull a lip, but to check the base for a faint spiral crack, invisible, until a fingernail sings it. The checksum catches corruption. Ideas copied with checks stay true under noise. Ideas without checks drift into uselessness. Guilds write the checks into oaths and tests. Name the 3 ways a kiln lies. Throw a jar blindfolded to this way. The gate is not eugenic, it is epistemic. It selects for knowers of the craft, not owners of a skull shape. The effect on survival is immediate. Fewer leaky jars, more stored grain, more children with full bowls in mart. Even entertainment does work for this fast selection. A story that celebrates a generous trader becomes popular because audiences enjoy thinking well of themselves. It also, quietly, advertises a norm. Plays shame the cheat, praise the civil guard who didn't take a bribe, lampoon the official who sold short measures. Laughter is enforcement with honey. The city's phenotype, its visible habits changes not only under fines, but under fashions of conscience. Genes cannot compete at this layer. They can only watch and, over very long span, bias tendencies that culture already pays for. The crucial humility is to remember that fast selection is not perfection. It can lock in bad habits as quickly as good rituals that waste scarce water, taboos that freeze a mistaken rule, bureaucracies that grow like vines and strangle the posts they were meant to brace. But culture has a gift biology lack. It can argue with itself. Heretics save city. Dissidents revise drainage code. A traveling potter shows a glaze that makes half the guild rethink a dogma. The cost of being wrong is paid in meeting, not in marrow. The cost of being right is an exhausted council and a better spring. Hold a last practical scene. In a town by a river with a mood for flooding, an old man and a girl stand beside a gauge stick carved with marks. The river licks at the lowest knot. When it kisses the 3rd line, the old man says, "We move the sacks and open the north gate." "Why the north?" the girl asks. "Because the last time we opened the south, the wind backed and we lost 3 carts." He points to a tablet on a nail in the gatehouse. A note from a flood. 2 grandmothers ago. The girl reads the few careful lines and nods. Tomorrow, when steeples reflect in brown water and carts creak in the higher streets, the town will keep its feet. No baby's femur will need to thicken over generations to outrun water. No pelvis will widen to carry stones fast. A sentence, carved once and remembered, outpaces mutation and holds back a river long enough for the sun to help. This is the hinge of our long argument, where the world allows it. We answer pressure with plan. Where it does not, we answer with small edit. The outline of us stays steady while the notebook thickens. We grew into creatures whose best inheritance is not in marrow, but in margin notes. Tonight, as lamps go out across the imagined plain, the notebooks lie ready by the door. In the morning, they will be revised again, and our bodies will remain, wonderfully, largely the same. There is a quiet pivot in our story, and it happens not in bone, but in emphasis. When the loud selection of cold, hunger, and chase softens under layers of habit and rule, a new environment comes to the fore, one made of other people. The main weather for a human life becomes social. Dinners and debts, gossip and grace, markets and marriages. The thin walls between courtyards, the long memory of a street. In that climate, the traits that rise are less about sprint or claw and more about the arts of living together. Patience, teachability, fairness, foresight, the knack for fitting your small excellence to someone else's. The phrase survival of the fittest had always been shorthand. Here it becomes actively misleading. Fittest becomes most compatible, most contributory, most able to help a group keep its promises to itself. Consider the grammar of a town morning. A baker keeps a sourdough culture alive by feeding it on time. A scribe copies a contract with a steady hand and no flourish, because flourish confuses. A midwife times a breath, waits out a panic, whispers a joke at exactly the moment fear loosens its hold. None of these gestures would matter in a sprint across an empty plain. In a web of interdependence, they are survival. The fitness landscape shifts from biceps to rhythms. The peaks become places where people coordinate cleanly. Pass tools instead of dropping them. Notice when a neighbor's breath has fallen off its normal tempo and ask, "Are you well?" A species that once had to outrun dusk now has to outpredict confusion. We may be tempted to fling grand words compassion, justice at this shift, and they are not wrong, but they risk turning practice into halo. The practical engine is simpler and humbler. Cooperation yields compounding returns in dense worlds. A single act of care spares a body that later teaches 3, who teach 9, who weave an institution that catches hundreds. A single rule, do not dump ash in the alley, prevents 10 fires, which preserve the workshops that keep 1,000 bowls filled, through which a generation lives to tell the next about the year the river rose and the gate held. Mercy is not only moral, it is a risk management technology. What does selection look like here? In this social weather, it looks like norms that invite certain temperaments forward and usher others to the margins. Impulsive cruelty loses market access. Chronic deceit loses credit and sleep. A hunger for status that cannot be quieted by useful work makes a person lonely in a way no feast can fix. Conversely, a baseline steadiness finds friends. Curiosity finds teachers. Humor diffuses quarrels before sticks come down. None of this pins to a single allele. Much of it sits in the foggy middle where predisposition meets upbringing, meets rewarded behavior, but over long span. In towns that jail fists and praise patience, the distribution of tempers drifts. The loudest edges dull because they cost too much for too many. The middle fattens where life goes better. Innovation replaces dominance as the way groups climb, not the hero in a tower innovation of romance, but the householder's kind. A new hinge that doesn't squeak, a brine that keeps cucumbers crisp into the 3rd month. A decimal place noticed and corrected in a ration list before the shortage becomes anger. In such an ecology, competition survives in softer clothes. Workshops vie to make a better pot, not by smashing rivals' wheels, but by quietly finding a clay that sings at a lower heat. The most fit are the most imitated. What spreads is what slots neatly into existing rhythms without demanding everyone else pay for one person's brilliance. If we squint, we can read this as an environmental inversion. In the old nights, the environment pushed us and we adapted or failed. In these new days, we build environments that push back on our worst impulses. A rule is a padded corner, a schedule is a guardrail. A festival is a ritualized release that drains away violence and refills belonging. The long experiment of urban life is the search for settings that make the decent thing easier than the cruel thing, the cautious thing cheaper than the reckless thing. Where such settings hold, bones need not thicken. Hearts do not have to calcify. Tempers can learn the ordinary miracle of restraint. Philosophy, in this light, is not a luxury. It is maintenance language we use to remind ourselves why the rails are where they are. Do unto others is a sentence you can teach a child before they understand reciprocity. Justice is what love looks like in public, says a sentiment much later. And even if the phrasing is new, the work is old. Make fairness visible enough that the street can carry it without an official uniform. Temples and courts, songs and story, all serve this maintenance. When the city forgets, it remembers painfully. A purge that devours its purgers, a riot that torches its own bakeries. Then it writes a new rule on the charred wall and calls it wisdom. The household becomes the training ground for the species' new contest. Children practice turn-taking over bowls and stories. They learn to wait for the clap in a song. They see adults apologize and repair. The lesson is not sentimental. It is rehearsal for markets and council, for watches passed at the gate, for the kind of attention that notices when the old neighbor's lamp did not light tonight. We do not grow larger brains to make this possible. We grow thicker weave. A single mind can fail. The cloth hold. There is a tenderness here that can be misread as weakness. It is not. Restraint is a strength made of memory. The choice not to humiliate a debtor is a bet that tomorrow you will need someone not to humiliate you. The choice to feed a stranger at the door is a bet that the rumor of your table will widen your kin beyond blood. These are bets that only make sense in an environment thick with return paths, roads, laws, names you can pronounce twice and find the same person still under them. Biology alone cannot build return paths. Only arrangements can. We can bring the candle and nightlight image forward now. Once, the camp needed the Brighton. Open flame that could warn predators and dry wet hides, flickering with the drama of risk. Now, much of life happens by the glow of smaller lights, a night watch lamp, a shrine's steady flame, the faint blue of dawn caught in a courtyard basin. These lights are less about keeping the dark at bay and more about reminding a house where its edges are where to step, where to set a pot, where a child's foot might find a stair in sleep. Culture is that nightlight, a soft signal that lets us move without breaking toes or tempers. The city becomes a memory palace. We walk by habit, blessing ourselves with the friction it saves us from every hour. This is not an argument against strength, only against its older idolatry. Strong backs still lift, fleet feet still run, keen eyes still find the crack in the pot that would have soured a season. But these strengths now matter most when yoked to service. The fastest runner carries water for a birth because that is the job that hour. The most cunning hunter teaches children how to read a cloud bank because the marsh will flood if they misjudge. The scribe with the cleanest hands spends a day copying a law she dislikes because she remembers a drought when a law she loved saved her uncle's life. Most fit becomes most fit for us. And us is the thickest invention we ever made. Let a small, closing scene settle. Evening in a courtyard. Warm air, heavy with the day's bread and the tannery's ghost. A grandfather shows a boy how to mend a cracked rim with a slip of clay that will vanish in the glaze. Turn the pot slowly, he said. So the fix becomes the pot, not a scar. Around it, the street hums someone laughing, someone tuning a string, someone coughing, someone bargaining gently over the price of figs at day's end. High above, a single window burns with a softer light than a torch. Steady and low, it doesn't shout. It says, here is the edge of the table. Here is the stair. Here is the way to move through a night made mostly of one another. In that glow, the old contest has not disappeared. It has changed feel. The victories we count are less about who outran the wolf and more about who taught the block to clean the ditch before the rain. Who started a song at the procession that made strangers' feet find the same beat. Who kept a ledger honest without shaming the poor. Biology made the instrument. Culture learns the music. We are, at last, the species that tunes itself patiently, sleepily, one nightlight at a time. Health learned to wear uniforms. For most of our long dusk, healing was a choreography of clean hands by the lamp, herbs with names remembered in songs, splints that matched Bones's tempers, them over centuries that now feel compressed into a few bright rooms. The choreography gathered instruments, lenses and levers, ledgers and laws, until illness became less a fate and more a system to manage. The old selection that trimmed the reckless and the unlucky softened under new shields. Soap with a recipe, needles boiled for a count of breaths, a glass that made a blurred world sharp. Bones did not change, outcomes did. Begin with sight, in a market, noisy with sums and small frauds. A scribe squints and finds the page dissolving. In another era, his ledger would pass to steadier eyes. His family's dinners would thin. In this one, someone grinds 2 little moons of glass and sets them in a frame. The world clicks letters that had become moths, turned back into marks. Eyeglasses are a spell that rescues aptitudes from the randomness of corneas, a whole category of minds meticulous, patient, brilliance at remembering where the numbers were, stays in the game. Later, lenses turn to telescopes and microscopes, enlarging not only stars and spores, but the reach of caution. A city that can see the animalcules in its water learns to boil, without needing a priest to threaten it into prudence. Soap is older than names for it, but rules about soap are newer and powerful. A midwife who standardizes what her grandmother knew: warm water, plain soap, trimmed nails, quiet room halts a fever that once walked from bed to bed in maternity wards. A surgeon who washes, who boils, who drapes, who ties his apron behind his neck so he cannot casually wipe his hands on it. He is not obeying a gene. He is obeying a schedule that cuts infection in half. These are small commandments that multiply survival with the same arithmetic as rice on a chessboard. They favor the teachable over the lucky, the careful over the merely strong. Consider needles on 2 different afternoons. In one, in a courtyard, a grandmother scratches a child's arm with a thorn dipped in pus from a recovered neighbor's pox, and whispers a prayer learned from women who watched too many winters. Variolation is crude, dangerous, and kinder than the disease's full appetite. In another, a century later, a vial rides in on a cold chain the length of a continent, and a drop under a tongue or a push into a deltoid teaches the immune system its lines without the old rehearsal wounds. Vaccination is culture distilled and distributed. It moves at the speed of logistics and persuasion. A town that can persuade enough of itself to line up for a sting has rerouted selection from the nursery to the clinic. The alleles do not need to change to see more birthdays. Customs did. Sewers become sermons in brick. We dug ditches for gardens and ditches for filth. Then we covered the latter and gave them gradients so they could be trusted. Someone measured slope by torchlight and marked a wall. If it sags here, fevers in spring. The city paid a man to remember the angle so the rest could forget. Cholera learned the new geometry. It traveled, yes, when pipes were brass and bribes were easier than repairs. But over time, the habit of slope and trap and flush placed a moat between us and the old watery deaths. A pelvis did not widen, a jaw did not thicken. A clerk's memo and a mason's string kept children. Anesthesia taught mercy a method before ether. Courage meant letting the saw sing while you bit leather. After ether and chloroform, mercy meant timing and dose. Bodies that would have been asked to be heroes every time now rested while knives did their work. This is not moral progress alone. It is selection bending toward the survivable. A person with a stone in the gut no longer needed to be born to pain tolerance. They needed to be born into a street where a bottle hung on a hook and a clock ticked gently on the wall. Antibiotics were a thunderclap and a bargain. For a while, bottles held summer for winter fevers. Wounds that once turned sweet and then deadly turned merely sore. Selection's teeth dulled quickly. Then the other arithmetic began, the one where life learns our tricks and answers with its own. Hospitals wrote new rules on top of old. Finish the course. Separate the sick. Track the microbes. Like thieves, the point is not triumphalism, but tempo. Culture can change a dosing schedule in a week. Genes cannot change a liver in a generation. The contest with bacteria forced culture to use its speed honestly. Insurance and registries paper cures altered who fell through cracks. A guild that covered a broken arm with dues. A mutual aid society that fed widows. A state that wrote a rule about who is entitled to bread when harvest fails. Each turned random misfortune into forecast expense. The body did not become invulnerable. It became buffered by promises. Selection's edge, which once bit the solitary and unlucky first, slid across a surface of pooled wrists. To survive, you needed less of a particular muscle and more of a particular citizenship, the ability to live under man and contribute. The agreements that kept the clinic's lamp lit. Public schooling, of all things, became a vaccine against ignorance that killed as surely as germ. A child learned to read a poster about boiling water, a notice about tainted grain, a timetable for the vaccination cart that visited on Tuesdays. Literacy let warnings move faster than rumors. Even partial schooling enough numbers to check a weight. Enough letters to match a name to a ledger made cheats rarer and medicine steady. The gene for skepticism does not exist. The habit of reading does, and it spreads in classrooms. Dentistry, mundane and huge, rescued hearts by saving mouths. Infections that once seeded fevers into blood diminished when people brushed with powders that tasted like chalk and wintergreen. A ritual at the basin became a dam against strokes 20 years later. So did shoes, quietly. Leather between skin and hookworm. Rubber between sole and sewage. These are technologies that decide whether a child's future height is stolen by a parasite in a season when the ditch ran high. Again, no new bone required, only a cord tied above an ankle, and a market that sells the cord cheap enough. Spectacle. So, sewer, syringe. The alliteration looks like a lesson in a horn book. The deeper pattern is the same one we have been tracing, where pressure is universal and cannot be diluted thin air. Hard parasites genes. Write small edits and keep them, where pressure can be intercepted by planning dirty water. Contagious breath culture writes the fix, copies it, finds those who forget, and sings about those who remembered in time. Gradually, the profile of fittest in this environment becomes indistinguishable from best at participating in the maintenance of shared systems. That can be learned. That can be taught at a sink. Of course, every shield casts a shadow. Cities that keep infants alive must then learn to feed teenagers. Medicines that spare lives must reckon with costs, with inequities, with resistant enemies that learn our names. Culture's speed can lock in foolishness as fast as wisdom, but culture's other gift argument keeps a hand on the tiller. A midwife refuses the old dirty apron. A doctor writes a letter about a pump handle. A clerk demands to see the weights. Heresy has a lease in the city of health. It pays its rent with better winters. Hold one last. Lit room. It smells of carbolic and stew. A nurse counts out loud, steady while washing. A child on a cot watches the ceiling and matches her breath to the count. A pharmacist ties a note to a bottle for a grandmother who cannot read numbers, but recognizes her own name in the loop the clerk draws under it. In the corner, a tray of polished lenses waits for faces. At the door, a bar of soap sits like a small white log. Outside, rain makes a clean rattle. Inside, 100 little rehearsals keep tomorrow more likely than yesterday. No new skull needed, only hand-counted steps, and a town that decided, together, to remember how night used to be a law. It said, stop, let the fire be a small sun, and keep your tasks within its circle. Then a string of inventions lamps that did not choke rooms, clocks that did not lie, wires that carried talk, dynamos that stored day inside copper, turned night from verdict to variable. The day lengthened by human agreement. Work took on a meter. Travel took on a timetable. Life took on choices that earlier centuries could not have phrased. Each choice, rehearsed widely enough, became another pad slipped between bodies and the old sharpness of chance. Begin with the clock, which is merely a patient drum in the square. A bell learns to speak in numbers. On a mantle, a pendulum writes small arcs that nudge households into rhythms they can share. Boats leave when the hand points here. Markets open when the chime counts 8. A midwife knows the dose because an hourglass says so, and later a watch confirms it. Railways force the issue. A line of iron, stitched across counties, cannot abide each village keeping its own sleepy noon. Standard time arrives pure coordination. No bone required, and with it a miracle that hides in boredom. Fewer collisions. More predictable breath. Letters that reach the right hands because the clerk and the carrier mean the same thing by Tuesday. Light followed in oils and gases, and abruptly in wires. A room becomes evening bright without smoke. A surgeon keeps steady hands after sunset. A student reads a page her grandmother would have saved for summer noon. The risks, fire, explosion, fatigue announce themselves, and culture answers with switches, codes, shade, shifts, union. Work stretches, so do protection. The old selection that culled by season and sun softens under filaments and rotas. A body no longer needs the eyes of an eagle to copy a ledger at dusk. At dusk if a lamp can be turned up. It needs the income to buy a lamp, the city to wire a street, the inspector to scold a landlord who would rather save copper than lives. Fitness leans into the ability to live inside systems of coordination, rather than muscle through darkness alone. Numbers become mirrors. Censuses count more than heads. They count births, deaths, fever, wages, rent. The first life tables are griefs arranged as arithmetic. The first public health maps are rumors nailed to walls. Here cholera walk, says a web of dots. Here it turn, says a new pipe. Statistics is a cold word for the warm habit of looking and updating. When towns learn to see themselves in columns and curves, they write laws that bend those curves. Milk standards after one scandal. Tenement rules after one fire too many. Pasteurization because a graph refused to be soothed by prayer. Bones stay bone. The street learns to read itself. Choice walks in with softer shoe. Contraception. For most of our time under stars, fertility was a tide with only a little room for timing by abstinence or luck. Herbs, amulets, methods half-whispered between midwives and lovers. These were local hacks on a strong current. Then knowledge coalesced into clinics and recipes, and later still, pills and devices that let bodies uncouple lovemaking from calendars. Maternal death falls when births space out. Children live when there are fewer of them to feed from one pair of hands. Women step into schools and shops and councils, and the definition of useful life swells past the cradle. Selection's grammar shifts again. It becomes less a contest of sheer fertility under constraint, and more a negotiation conducted in classrooms and pay ledgers, in desires, in plan. Genes do not vanish from the room. Culture begins choosing which rooms to build and how many chairs to set out. Demography changes shape first slowly, then all at once, as mortality plunges and fertility follows. The famous transition drawn in textbooks like a valley between two hills. The valley smells of vaccinations and drains, of soap and schooling, of midwives who insist on clean hands and the right to rest. In that valley, survival is less about the strongest beating winter and more about the many participating in schedules and rules. The fittest, if we insist on that tired word, are those most able to live within a network, keeping appointments, honoring rations when they are necessary, reading notices, negotiating marriages where love and livelihood both speak. The genome does not flinch. It hums under a ceiling it met long ago, while the city lifts the floor. Travel stretches kinship like warm resin. Steam shrinks oceans, steel bites mountains. Later, air shrinks continents to a day's patience and a plastic cup of water. With every new line, gene flow quickens and culture flow bursts bank. Marriages cross dialects. Cuisines cross windowsills. Tools recombine in mouths in shops that have never shared a sunrise. Assortative mating, the sober phrase for how like finds like learns new logic. Sometimes they are tender two readers who meet in a library. Sometimes they are narrow two fortunes, guarded by a contract. The long-term effect is not a new skull, but a finer-grained social map. Subcultures with their own schedules and tastes, mixing and separating like currents in a wide river, yet all contained by the river's banks of law and market. Selection's gradients blur further because shocks are shared faster and cushions are laid in more places. Work changes its injury, and then changes again. Looms bite fingers until guards are fitted. Shafts take lungs until masks are issued. Stairs take spines until rails are required. Unions are culture's calluses. They form after repetition and pain, and then thicken into rights that a child grows up finding obvious. A day off to be human, a limit on hours, a rule about age. The body that thrives here is not a new model. It is an ordinary frame with a learned insistence. No, we do it this way now. We learned why. That insistent solidarity is itself adaptive in a world where risk is made by arrangements more than by weather. The ledger of childhood rewrites itself. Once, to have many was to hedge against loss. Now, to have fewer can be to invest in depth. Schooling, shoes that fit in the wet month, a dentist's chair that saves a fever. Education lengthens adolescence, and with it the time for skills to accrete like fine sediment. Reading, numbers, instruments, foreign tongues. The brain inside that schooling is not larger. It is scaffolded by curriculums and exams, by libraries and laboratories, by mentors paid by taxes to turn curiosity into work. Variation in life outcomes tilts more toward these scaffolds than toward a jaw's bite strength or a calf's spring. Selection listens to classrooms as much as to winter. Faith learns to share the plaza with newspapers. Later, radios learn to argue with both. Later still, screens learn to sing at every hour and pick their listeners one by one. Information becomes weather, sometimes nourishing, sometimes storm. Publics learn the first halting grammars of skepticism, source, method, replication, humility, when they forget. Epidemics remind, when they remember, curves bend. The trait under fast selection here is not gullibility or genius, but the practiced habit of checking before sharing, of waiting one day before acting on a rumor that could hurt a neighbor. The city teaches this with fines and with cartoons. The genome watches. Patient. Not every new cushion is soft. Some are gates. Systems exclude as well as protect. A teletype can amplify lies. A passport can trap. A wage can chain. A pill can be hoarded. Culture's speed can lock cruelty into code and call it neutral. The counter-habit, the dissident's muscle, remains vital. Laws are unlearned. Schedules are rewritten. Lights are turned off so stars can return to children. Factories are moved, rebuilt, argued with. The same capacity that made night pliable must be turned now and then to making it dark again. For sleep, for birds, for the sky's old arithmetic. Progress is not a ramp. It is a map with detours, repair, and rest stop. Stand, for a moment, in a station with a high clock. The hands move, people do too. In choreographies, they do not need to explain. A mother checks a child's shoulder for a strap. A porter looks down a platform, not for danger, but for habit. A tea seller refills cups by count, not by guess. Announcements murmur in 2 languages. A sign in 3 scripts points to the clinic. A poster shows a drop of water with a monster drawn inside it to charm a child into boiling. The air smells faintly of oil and cardamom. A storm is coming, perhaps. The day's trains will still make most of their meetings with towns where other clocks keep faith. No one's femur will lengthen to catch a ride. 1,000 small agreements did that already. Choice, coordination, light, law together. They built a second day inside the first and tucked more lives safely into it. The outline of us did not need to change. Our calendars did. Our maps did. Our expectations did. Where once the sky's tilt decided when to eat and marry and move, now tables and timetables do much of that deciding. Imperfectly and revisably, the old selection has not vanished. It waits in storms and in earthquake, in new microbes with old appetite, in our own foolishness. But it meets us now through glass and ink and wire and argument. We answer with bulbs and bills, with clean hands and clean data, with a nurse's schedule and a union strike vote, with a pill on a tongue and a fence along a river that knows its moods. Let a last image be small and precise. A woman stands at a sink at 14 p. A time that did not exist in her great-great-grandmother's house. She rinses a bottle, sets tomorrow's dose where morning hands will not forget, checks a calendar square marked with a midwife's name, and turns off a light that has turned a long day gentler without stealing the night. Through a window, another apartment's lamp glows. Below, a bus sighs. On the corner, a clock catches 1 more minute and lets it go. No new skull needed. Only a web of hours and rules that turns luck into plan. Plan into habit. Habit into the softest kind of shelter. A schedule shared. We came looking for a turning point and found, instead, a change of instrument. The old, loud music ice. Hunger. Teeth did not stop. It moved to the back of the hall, while softer sections took the melody. Strings of custom, drums of schedule, reeds of law. The low brass of care these played on and on until the outline of us, already drawn, no longer needed redrafting every harsh season. Tonight, before sleep, let the long arc settle. Ash-dark skies to lamplit room. Travel stones to tablets, hearth to hospital, rumor to register, sprint to choreography, where the world pressed hourly and could not be bargained with. Bodies learned small, elegant edits, where pressure could be bargained with through tools. Timetables. Teaching we bargained, and the bargain held. The secret was not genius stacked like towers, but patience laid like roads. A grandmother's rule about washing hands before touching a newborn. A mason string stretched to the right fall. A napper's quiet correction of angle. A herder's whistle learned by a child. A clerk's tally kept honest by a neighbor's glance. A midwife's joke that unstiffens fear. A night watch's lamp that moves down the wall like a second moon. Each was tiny, dull even, and together they were weather. A climate of continuity that let ordinary brains become extraordinary networks. Genes kept house. Culture furnished rooms. Memory learned to live outside the skull. So nothing as fragile as one life had to hold it alone. Look at the ledger we have drawn. In one column, embers in bark tube. Hood sewn tight, strings spun against the thigh, beads that say us, nets widened by a thumb, weirs paced by song, shells as credit and promise, rules about ash and alleys, weights that match, markets that find liars, kennels dredged on time, tablets that keep tempers cool, soap that forgets no winter, lenses that rescue aptitude, vaccines that teach blood kindly, drains that slow, lights that lengthen evening, clocks that make strangers share a noon. In the other column, bodies largely familiar to those who walked beaches before the ash fell. Pelvises still negotiating birth, jaws recording childhoods in their faint lines, hands built to learn rather than to be born, knowing. The first column is what changed most. The second is what we carried through. The moral, if we need one, is not that biology yielded to culture as if one surrendered and the other conquered. It is that biology built a creature whose best trick was to offload risk into arrangements, agreements, recipe, rituals, records, so that genes could stop sprinting for every goal and stroll toward local problems that never learned to listen to law. Milk where herds stood, breath where air thinned, blood where old parasites kept their riddle everywhere else. Notebooks by doors, songs that pace work, stories that move fairness from feeling to practice. We stopped evolving as a bedtime simplification. We changed the loud venue. The orchestra stilled tunes, now to a score that institutions can revise between winters. Before we close our eyes, return once to the first camp by the ash-cooled shore. Someone pressed a palm to stone and blew ochre around it, an outline of a hand that still looks like yours. If you stand beside it, with your head tilted just so. The mark did not boast. It said, I stood here. We stand here. This is a human place. Our species has been adding margins to that first outline ever since, writing notes that say how to keep water sweet, how to hold children through a fever, how to mend a rim so the fix becomes the pot, how to meet when the hill swallows the sun. Tonight's story has been one long margin, a quiet argument that the outline held, while the notes grew thick enough to be a shelter. Now let the room go dim. Hear the small futures rehearsing, a kettle set for morning, a ledger closed with a string, a lamp turned down, a child's breath sinking to account, a neighbor's foot on the stair at the hour she promised. Outside, weather keeps its old, enormous counsel. Inside, our second world hum, rules and ropes, lights and lists, jokes and songs, hands and habit. We will need all of it again tomorrow, the patient, the revision, the long kindness that catches fallible bodies before the hard ground does. For now, set it down. We made it through a winter older than names by learning to think together. We can sleep inside that skill.